Bene, buongiorno a tutti, welcome everyone. We can start the third section of the week, Landowners and Manufacturers, la terza sessione, Proprietari, Terrieri e Produttori. Avremo quest'oggi 3 presentazioni, faremo una piccola pausa al termine della terza presentazione per lasciare poi tempo per il dibattito. We will let a little break after the presentation, then the debate. The first speaker is the colleague of the Leiden University, Lewis Wade, who will present his text about manufacturing markets, managing the industrial risk of Franco-Asian commerce, 1683-72. Please.
Thank you. I'd first of all like to thank the Foundation for their efforts in organising the study week and welcoming me to speak today. At its core, my paper is a study of entrepreneurs and the management of industrial risk. In the modern world, entrepreneurs are seen first and foremost as risk managers. Accomplished entrepreneurs reap the rewards from successfully navigating the uncertainties of the market, while recognizing that they themselves will bear the burden of the financial pain if the tide turns against them. My paper complicates this understanding of the relationship between entrepreneurialism and risk-taking by looking at the so-named entrepreneurs of Sapt and Villers-du-Vet, 2 royal factories operating in the remote province of the Languedoc in southern France in the late 17th century. These factories specialized in producing high-quality woolen cloth, or drap, for foreign markets. What you can see here are remarkably well-preserved samples of Languedocian cloth from around 1750 that I found in the archives of Marseille's Chamber of Commerce last year. And these give you a sense of what these factories were manufacturing. Historians to date have rightly stressed that Languedocian cloth dominated the markets of the Levant, shown here in the first half of the 18th century. However, in exploring the nature of the factory's activities, I will focus especially on their production for the French East India Company, or the CIO, the Compagnie des Indes Orientales. The high-quality cloth that was being made for the Levantine markets was purchased and sent by the CIO to the East Indies from the 1680s to the early 1700s. This was the product of a peculiar trading dynamic which invites us to reflect on the role of entrepreneurs in early modern France in undertaking projects that were perceived to serve the public good. The 1660s marked the beginning of a series of reforms introduced by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's famous Minister of Finance. Within his wide-reaching economic and commercial policies, Colbert envied Dutch and English success in the Ottoman markets and wanted to transform the now dead cloth industry of the Languedoc into Europe's leading producer of fine woolen cloth. Among his many reforms, Colbert threw his support in the 1660s behind Sapt, near Carcassonne, and Villers-du-Vet, near Clermont-de-la-Dève, and these were royal factories that had received significant private investment in order to develop the infrastructure needed to compete with their Dutch and English rivals. As we can see here, the original 17th century factory at Villers-du-Vet remains remarkably well preserved to this day. Progress did not come quickly, however, and by 1682, Sapt and Villers-du-Vet were on the verge of collapse. One of Colbert's final acts before his death in 1683 was to secure a bailout for the factories. Foreign investors came out of the woodwork to finance the factories as a single company. In recompense, this new company received remarkably generous terms. In exchange for committing to keep at least 30 looms in activity at each of the factories, the estates of the Languedoc granted the company an interest-free loan for 6 years of 130,000 livres tournois, the currency of account in France at the time, the cost of Villers-du-Vet's rent, and a bounty of 10 livres per piece of cloth produced, which was matched by the king as well. Lyon was also enlisted to make an annual grant to the company of 6,000 livres for 10 years. The factories were also supported by two of Louis XIV's chartered companies, my focus today being on the CIO, the East India Company. After Colbert's death in 1683, oversight of the Languedocian factories and France's chartered companies was taken over by Colbert's son, the Marquis de Seignelay, who became Secretary of State for Maritime Affairs. Seignelay was supported by Jean-Baptiste de Lagny, Director General of Commerce. The CIO had been established by Colbert in 1664 with the goal of challenging the successes of the Dutch and English East India Companies. Although the CIO had not achieved commercial success under Colbert, it had managed to establish secure trading posts at Surat in Gujarat and Pondicherry on the Coromandel coast. After Seignelay instituted a major restructuring in 1685, which brought new capital and new directors into the mix, the CIO found itself at the centre of a large debate at Versailles. Cloth producers in France had started arguing that the CIO was a drain on the French economy, exporting much-needed specie from the kingdom while importing calicos, like the one seen here, that were devastating to French industry. These arguments proved persuasive at Versailles, and a ban was instituted in 1686 on the import of Indian cottons and other textiles. This ban struck at the core of the CIO's business. Since its establishment, Indian cottons had been its core import. Desperate to protect the company's commerce and credits, the directors sought a series of exemptions. A royal order of January 1687 gave the CIO limited rights to continue importing Indian cottons, as well as permission to import 150,000 livres of patterned silks per year. In exchange, the directors committed explicitly to exporting 500,000 livres of French merchandise per year to the East Indies. There we go. The factories of Saintes and Villers-du-Vet rapidly emerged as the major beneficiaries of the CIO's compulsory export regime. The CIO was already submitting orders in 1686 for cloth to be sent to Siam, modern-day Thailand. Sadly, I'll have to save this discussion for another day, but the company's dealings with the factories intensified soon after the royal order in January 1687. Lagny was eager for the CIO to immediately make preparations to send ships to Surat loaded with French manufactures. To this end, Lagny wrote to Seignelay on the 6th of July, advising him to press the directors, and I quote, to have woolen cloth made in the Languedoc and to prepare other things which make a profit in the Indies, with the goal of reducing specie exports. I believe, he stressed, Monseigneur should also urge the directors to offer slightly more favourable terms to the entrepreneur of the Clermont and Sapt factories and tell them there is a profit to be made on our cloth in the Indies. 600 pieces of cloth from Sapt and Villers-du-Vet were loaded on the Saint-Nicolas in Port-Louis alongside other merchandise and specie totalling 150,000 livres, and the vessel set sail to Pondicherry in October 1687. This kicked off a 15-year period in which Languedocian cloth was the chief French manufacture exported to India. Sapt and Villers-du-Vet signed long-term contracts with the CIO, committing to minimum annual purchases of cloth for a set price. This was posing problems for the factories heading into 1688, however, as the rising costs of Spanish wool and cochineal meant they were starting to produce cloth for the company at a loss. Much to Seignelay chagrin, the entrepreneur chose to simply drag their feet on these orders, and when Seignelay demanded an explanation, they claimed that they could not fulfill their contracts on the basis of the agreed terms. Seignelay therefore looked to the company to bear the uncertainty of the market in primary materials by agreeing to retroactive changes to its contracts with factories. In writing to the company's directors in early 1688, Seignelay stressed that the factories were, and would continue to be, under orders to prioritize its commissions over all others and fulfill them to the highest possible standard. In exchange, Seignelay insisted that the directors needed to engage with the entrepreneur of the factories to agree to a fair price, and I quote, until the raw materials return to their ordinary price. Bowing to royal pressure, the CIO's directors agreed to new terms, and the factories began to fulfill the company's orders again. New problems arose, however, with the onset of the 9 Years' War in late 1688. Owing to financial and commercial challenges created by the war, only a single small CIO vessel left for the Indian Ocean between February 1690 and March 1692. When the CIO cancelled its order with Villeneuve in 1690, the factory stood to make a loss, having already started to produce the cloth the company had commissioned. While Seignelay asked its director, Pierre Barthes, to be sympathetic to the CIO's directors, the suspension of shipments to India, after all, was largely beyond their control. Seignelay nevertheless agreed that Barthes should not suffer any loss as a result of the CIO's ongoing woes. Seignelay promised to negotiate a solution with the CIO's directors to cover Barthes' costs. By the end of the year, Seignelay had died and was succeeded by Louis Philippot, Comte de Pontchartrain. Pontchartrain was emphatic that the CIO needed to fulfill its contracts with the factories, even during the suspension of its activities. After Barthes informed him that the CIO had not made an order in 1691, Pontchartrain wrote to the directors in July, stressing that, and I quote, "This factory, as well as that of Sapt, was established to provide woolen cloth for the Levant and for your own trade. It is therefore necessary that you are contributing to maintaining Villeneuve, and that you ask Sir Barthes to provide you with the cloth he can make to deliver to you between now and the departure of your next vessels, until you can give him more considerable orders for the shipments you will undertake in the future." Pontchartrain also sought an order from Sapt beyond the CIO's contract with the factory, stressing that the king would be satisfied in seeing them, and I quote, "making your commerce as useful to the kingdom as possible." 3 CIO vessels set sail from Lorient in March 1692, bound for Surat. These were loaded with 260,000 livres of cloth from Sapt and Villeneuve. Cloth exports to India continued up to the turn of the century. While the CIO's agents originally had some sporadic success in selling Languedocian cloth, especially in Surat and Bengal, these markets became increasingly shallow as political crises rippled throughout the Indian subcontinent. By the turn of the century, the CIO's trading posts were entirely oversaturated, with its warehouses in Surat alone being filled with a stash of 2,500 unsold pieces of Languedocian cloth in 1702. Just to put this into context, a piece of Languedocian cloth for the Indian market was not small at all, somewhere in the region of 25 meters per piece. So the Surat warehouses were housing around 60 kilometers of cloth in total. Unsurprisingly, Louis Pillavoine wrote from Surat to the metropolitan directors in early 1702, pleading with them to send specie rather than merchandise. In a candid letter expressing similar sentiments, André Deslandes-Bureau wrote from Bengal in November 1700 that, and I quote, "It is not possible to make people buy things they do not need, especially the Indians, whose fashion and outfits, Deslandes insisted, never change." So put simply, by the turn of the 18th century, the CIO was paying for the luxury of carrying Languedocian cloth on its ships and then storing it indefinitely in the company's Indian warehouses. In 1702, the directors managed to convince the Crown to relieve them of their commitment to export 500,000 livres of French manufactures per year. Although it is not yet clear to me if it had ever met this obligation in full, it had certainly invested heavily in the cloth of Sapt and Villeneuve between 1686 and 1702, almost certainly to the tune of millions of livres. To contextualize this, the intendant of the Languedoc estimated in 1698 that the province was producing close to 1 million livres worth of cloth for the Levantine market per year. So the CIO's contribution was substantial. So who was bearing the uncertainties entailed in the production, transportation, and sale of Languedocian cloth after 1683? There is an idiom that goes, nothing ventured, nothing gained. The successful entrepreneur, as we know them today, gains because they venture. That is to say, they soundly judge the risks they face and accept the uncertainties that can bring even the most well-founded enterprise to the ground. Yet, when faced with the volatility of commodity markets, it was not the entrepreneur of the Languedoc who bore the costs, but the CIO, which was pressured into accepting retroactive changes to its contracts to relieve the Languedocian factories of losses. When war crippled the CIO's finances and credits, threatening a key revenue stream for the Languedocian factories, the CIO was still required to step up to the plate and keep to the purchases it committed to in its contracts. By the turn of the 18th century, the CIO had become an unwilling underwriter of the Languedocian cloth industry, dumping cloth on the Indian market without hope of sale. Let us return then to what we mean by an entrepreneur in 17th century France. Here we can see the definition of entrepreneur given by the 1718 edition of the dictionary compiled by the Académie Française. The root of the word in the French verb entreprendre, to undertake something, is clear, but focusing on the second and third definitions given here, we can see something more complex in this. The entrepreneur is understood to be someone who undertakes public works or other endeavors involving often complex logistics. The logic of these definitions center then on acting in one way or another in service to public interests, or one might say, the public good. This invites us to revisit decidedly modern understandings of entrepreneurialism within the context of free markets and private enterprise. Sapt and Villeneuve received what was effectively a public bailout in 1683, and they continued to be subsidized extensively in the years that followed. Also, as we've seen, the CIO was forced to justify its activities after 1686 in relation to the public good. Exporting Languedocian cloth became one of its key responsibilities because the production of Languedocian cloth itself was perceived by Seignelay and Pontchartrain to serve the public good. As a result, it was the CIO, rather than the factories, that were expected to bear many of the uncertainties of the market. Sapt and Villeneuve receiving this support was not antithetical to entrepreneurial values. To the contrary, the directors received this support precisely because they were entrepreneurs in the eyes of the state. This support was not trivial. After 1683, Sapt and Villeneuve were a source of remarkable success and vigour, even during the severe economic downturn witnessed in France during the 9 Years' War. This translated into well-paid employment for a province that was otherwise heavily agrarian in its pursuits. The table here outlines the apprenticeships that were registered with notaries in Clermont-de-la-Dève in the period 1686 to 1700. The cloth industry contributed significantly, with the technical know-how to create the cloth demanded in the discerning Levantine market being transmitted to an ever-increasing body of weavers. This investment in human capital paid off in the long run. We do not have consistent production figures for the Levantine market until the turn of the 18th century, but what is clear is that production remained decidedly modest up to the 1680s, perhaps less than 1,000 pieces per year, before taking a large leap forward in the 1690s, between 4,000 and 6,000 pieces per year, and then surging at the turn of the century, peaking at well over 60,000 pieces per year in the 1730s. To quote James Thompson, no sector of the French economy grew more rapidly than the Languedoc's cloth industry in the first half of the 18th century, no trade as rapidly as the Levant. The CIO's investment in the Languedoc, likely amounting to millions of livres, came at a critical moment, facilitating the development of Sapt and Villers-du-Vet into stable, mature enterprises. The human capital these factories fostered in turn fueled other royal and private factories, which, in the first half of the 18th century, made Carcassonne, Clermont de Lodève, and Saint-Chinian the leading European centres of production for the Levantine market. In this way, although the directors of Sapt and Villers-du-Vet were neither masters of risk management nor even the bearers of uncertainty in many cases, they nevertheless lived up to their roles as entrepreneurs, undertaking complex, capital-intensive operations in service to ministerial conceptions of the public good. Understanding just how significant the CIO was in the development of the Languedocian cloth industry is my goal going forwards with my research. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentation that, in my perspective, is even more interesting for the extension to the risk area to India. I will return about it later with some questions. And then we pass to the second presentation by Matteo Di Tullio dell'Università di Pavia. He'll present a presentation about risk sharing in agriculture, institutions and practices of cooperation in early modern Lombardy. Prego, Matteo.
Ringrazio anzitutto la Fondazione per la possibilità di presentare il mio paper qui. È sempre un onore, un piacere essere a Prato a presentare le proprie ricerche. Avendo presentato un paper in inglese e avendo una presentazione in inglese, io approfitto, diciamo così, di essere in casa e presenterò in italiano. Perdonatemi, spero che la presentazione si capirà ugualmente. Questa presentazione si focalizza su come i rischi in agricoltura erano in un qualche modo gestiti collettivamente dalle società di antico regime, però devo fare alcune precisazioni prima di entrare nel dettaglio della mia presentazione. La prima è che tra tardo medioevo e prima età moderna la Lombardia ha sperimentato una precoce diffusione dell'agricoltura capitalistica, e questo aspetto è un aspetto che dobbiamo tenere in considerazione perché è piuttosto importante in quello che andrò a dire. L'agricoltura lombarda diviene una delle agricolture più avanzate d'Europa in quel periodo, anche se siamo comunque in una regione fortemente popolata, densamente popolata. La seconda precisazione è che io in questa presentazione mi focalizzerò solo sulla dimensione collettiva della distribuzione del rischio e sui rischi che io definisco ordinari, poi vi dirò perché parlo di rischi ordinari, cioè quegli eventi che si verificano con una certa frequenza, ma anche se si verificano con una certa frequenza, questo non vuol dire che le società di antico regime sono capaci di gestirli in modo efficace. Devono creare delle istituzioni o delle azioni per gestirli, ma non necessariamente riescono a farlo efficacemente. Terzo e ultimo punto, e poi entro nel dettaglio, quello che vado a presentare è la sistematizzazione di alcune ricerche sulla agricoltura lombarda che ho già sviluppato e che cerco di leggere quindi a partire da queste lenti nuove, diciamo così, del risk management e della gestione del rischio. E questa rilettura, stimolata da questa call del Datini, in realtà mi ha permesso di mettere in luce, o spero che sarete d'accordo con me, di mettere in luce una complessità di relazioni che sono fondamentali a gestire collettivamente il rischio in agricoltura. Partirò con una breve presentazione, con una breve riflessione su cosa significa rischi ordinari in agricoltura. Allora, se il rischio in generale può essere definito, come tutti noi sappiamo, la variabilità dei risultati futuri, in agricoltura il rischio è collegato alla incerta e imprevedibile possibilità che si verificano alcuni eventi che hanno un impatto negativo sul prodotto. Questi eventi sono di varia natura, non entrerò ovviamente nel dettaglio, climatica, biologica, tecnologica, politica, e ovviamente c'è anche il mercato, ma su questo aspetto del mercato tornerò nel dettaglio più avanti. Alcuni di questi rischi chiaramente sono potenzialmente di carattere individuale, cioè riguardano la singola impresa, il singolo agricoltore, però, e questo è il mio punto di partenza, il loro impatto ha una dimensione sociale enorme, anche se si tratta di rischi di imprese individuali, poiché queste hanno a che fare con una delle priorità di queste società, che è l'alimentazione, evidentemente il fallimento individuale ha un effetto sociale enorme, e questo è il punto di partenza. Per questo è necessario provare a riflettere un attimo su qual è la percezione del rischio dalla diversa prospettiva delle componenti che caratterizzano le società di antico regime. Da un punto di vista urbano, la sfida è quella soprattutto di assicurarsi approvvigionamento di beni di prima necessità, di cereali soprattutto, ad un prezzo basso e stabile. Sappiamo che i prezzi nelle economie preindustriali non sono necessariamente il riflesso della relazione perfetta tra domanda e offerta, però diciamo, se noi li osserviamo nel lungo periodo, come un termometro ci danno la temperatura, diciamo così, della relazione tra disponibilità alimentari e quantità di popolazione da sfamare. In questi due grafici, e in particolare in quello di sinistra, vi mostro l'andamento del prezzo del grano, del frumento, in 3 città lombarde. Sono serie indipendenti basate sul prezzo svalutato in grammi d'argento, in modo tale da incorporare ovviamente la svalutazione. Quello che vediamo è una progressiva crescita del costo di questo prodotto, con alcuni picchi collegati ad alcune crisi su cui adesso ovviamente non ho intenzione di soffermarmi, o non ho l'opportunità, scusate, di soffermarmi, però la tendenza di crescita nelle 3 città lombarde, se vedete, è più bassa e in un qualche modo ha dei picchi meno pronunciati rispetto a quello che succede a altre 3 città che ho messo in correlazione. Tenete conto che la scala dei due grafici è uguale, che sono Verona, Parma e Modena. Quindi altre città che pure hanno attorno una vasta area di pianura. Cosa ci dicono questi due grafici? Ci riportano a quello che stavo cercando di dire all'inizio, e cioè che in Lombardia abbiamo una produzione agricola nel corso del Cinquecento molto elevata, e questo gli permette, nonostante siamo in un'area densamente popolata, di tenere i prezzi più bassi e più stabili che in altre città del nord Italia affacciate, diciamo così, sulla pianura padana. Tuttavia, la pressione demografica, soprattutto la pressione demografica nel corso della seconda metà del Cinquecento, tende a mettere sotto pressione la produzione cerealicola e quindi anche, in un qualche modo, di riflesso produce una crescita dei prezzi. Dalla prospettiva delle società rurali, ovviamente, la questione del rischio agricolo è molto diverso. Teniamo conto che la grande maggioranza della popolazione rurale aveva come obiettivo prioritario la riproduzione, nel senso che il loro obiettivo era quello di ottenere abbastanza per pagare la rendita al proprietario terriero in beni o in denaro, vendere una piccola parte, quella piccola parte di prodotto che gli serve per ottenere quel denaro che è necessario per pagare le tasse, essenzialmente per le piccole transazioni monetarie di cui hanno bisogno, avere qualcosa per seminare quell'anno e quindi poi per il raccolto dell'anno successivo, e ovviamente sfamare i membri della propria famiglia. La composizione di queste 4 categorie, di questi 4 elementi, dipende ovviamente dallo specifico sistema agronomico Quello lombardo, abbiamo detto, è un sistema agronomico particolarmente ricco, e ovviamente dall'andamento dei raccolti annuali. Tuttavia, le prime due componenti, cioè la quota che si deve al proprietario terriero e la quota per il mercato, è relativamente incomprimibile. E quindi ciò che va sacrificato in un caso di raccolto negativo è ovviamente che cosa? Ciò che noi destiniamo al raccolto o a sfamare la popolazione. Quindi un anno particolarmente difficile o una serie, ancora peggio, una serie di anni particolarmente difficili portano la gran parte della popolazione rurale in un ciclo di indebitamento nei confronti di chi? Soprattutto nei confronti dei proprietari terrieri, che anticipano le sementi e che danno tutta una serie di, come dire, elementi che sono fondamentali per la loro sussistenza. La prospettiva è ovviamente molto diversa la questione è decisamente molto diversa dalla prospettiva dei proprietari terrieri. I proprietari terrieri ovviamente hanno come obiettivo principale quello di ottenere la rendita, non necessariamente un profitto, ma la rendita, una rendita stabile. Cosa se ne fanno di questa rendita? Beh, tipicamente la utilizzano per le necessità familiari e per il risparmio una parte e per l'investimento in terre che già hanno oppure in altre che vogliono acquistare. Ma nella Lombardia di età moderna c'è un terzo gruppo sociale che dobbiamo tenere in considerazione, che sono i grandi affittuari terrieri capitalisti, che hanno come obiettivo principale quello di ottimizzare i fattori di produzione, cioè lavorano già con una prospettiva di produzione per il mercato. Il loro obiettivo è ottenere la più grande quantità possibile di prodotto da vendere sul mercato, sui mercati urbani prevalentemente, ma anche su quelli rurali. Quindi i loro obiettivi sono ovviamente quelli di ottenere questi grandi risultati, e il prodotto viene utilizzato ovviamente, oltre che per sfamare la propria famiglia, la propria household, per il risparmio o per gli investimenti. Nonostante questi gruppi sociali, sia quelli urbani e quelli rurali, hanno degli obiettivi diversi, è chiaro però che la sfida comune di tutti questi gruppi sociali è quella di avere abbastanza raccolto per poter anzitutto garantire la sussistenza della popolazione. Perché una scarsità di prodotto ha effetti negativi generali, e quindi da questo punto di vista, per questa ragione, io dico che il primo e, come dire, ordinario rischio che devono gestire in maniera collettiva dalla prospettiva agricola le società di antico regime è appunto quella di avere sufficiente prodotto. Anche perché i raccolti scarsi in una società di questo tipo non solo hanno, diciamo così, una negatività di per sé, ma hanno anche un effetto molto negativo per come funziona il mercato in queste società. Infatti, essendo società fortemente basate sull'autoconsumo, quello che succede è che la domanda collettiva di cereali, e qui riprendo una elaborazione fatta da Marco Cattini qualche anno fa, tende a crescere significativamente quindi a passare da D0, D1, D2, quando i raccolti sono poveri, o 0, o 1, o 2, e la popolazione rurale non ha abbastanza per poter soddisfare le proprie necessità con quello che ha raccolto. Il risultato qual è? È che la pressione sul mercato è molto forte e i prezzi crescono rapidamente, molto rapidamente, e le parti più povere della popolazione devono approvvigionarsi sul mercato proprio quando il costo dei cereali è altissimo. Quindi la conseguenza di questo processo è che è chiaramente un problema sociale quello che può produrre una scarsità di raccolto, non solo un problema individuale. Per gestire questi rischi, per i possibili negativi effetti di questi rischi, le società di età moderna sperimentano diverse azioni, diverse tipologie di interventi. Tutte queste ho deciso di concentrarmi su 4 di queste, di portare 4 esempi principali. Il primo è una riflessione sulle forme relative alla proprietà della terra e soprattutto all'accesso alla terra e all'affitto. Il secondo punto riguarda le azioni urbane, rurali e in parte anche statali delle istituzioni in relazione alla necessità di sostenere la food supply, ok, va bene, ci siamo capiti, scusate. Il terzo è la creazione di istituzioni che permettono di gestire l'ambiente e quindi di rendere la gestione dell'ambiente più stabile anche per avere un prodotto maggiore. E ultimo porterò un esempio di in pratica informale di distribuzione del rischio, cioè quella della diffusione dei servitori rurali, e poi arrivo su questo punto. Partiamo dalla questione dei contratti. La proprietà e le differenti forme di accesso alla terra sono assolutamente importanti nella gestione del rischio e durante l'età moderna quello che si verifica in Lombardia è una costante tendenza a scaricare il rischio verso le popolazioni rurali e la parte più povera della popolazione. In che modo? In particolare attraverso la trasformazione dei contratti agrari che sempre meno, o meglio, includono la divisione equa del contratto, le forme di mezzadria classiche, verso invece forme di tassi fissi annuali o, come dire, divisione del raccolto in parti, ma con rapporti meno equi e soprattutto più sfavorevoli per i lavoratori della terra. E in particolare in Lombardia con la trasformazione degli affitti piuttosto precoce, cioè già nel Cinquecento, verso una rendita annuale, un affitto annuale stabilito ex ante, in prodotti o ancora peggio, per le ragioni che ho detto prima, in denaro. Questo ovviamente non è un processo universale né lineare, è qualcosa che si muove, diciamo, in una maniera abbastanza dinamica in queste società, però è qualcosa che si verifica in modo sistematico e che va di pari passo con il progressivo definitivo superamento di ogni forma di campi aperti, di sistema di open field e di agricoltura di villaggio in queste società e la marginalizzazione dei beni collettivi. Se dal punto di vista dei contratti il rischio è trasferito dalla proprietà verso le società rurali e soprattutto verso la parte più povera della società, le società di età moderna vedono però il consolidamento e, se vogliamo, anche il miglioramento di istituzioni che in un qualche modo sono istituite per gestire l'irregolarità dei raccolti. In particolare mi riferisco a quelle che in Italia vengono chiamate annone o ufficiali di provvisione, cioè tutte quelle istituzioni urbane e poi progressivamente diventate parte dell'apparato burocratico dello Stato, che hanno come obiettivo quello di tenere sott'occhio l'andamento dei raccolti con azioni come quella mostrata in questa immagine, cioè i cosiddetti censi di bocche biade, nei quali si faceva una stima della popolazione presente e delle biade disponibili, cioè del raccolto disponibile nelle campagne, per capire se si era di fronte ad una crisi dei raccolti oppure no, con l'obiettivo di far che cosa? Di mitigare ovviamente la possibile crescita rapida dei prezzi. L'obiettivo era quello di anticipare una possibile crisi e quindi eventualmente approvvigionarsi di cereali su mercati lontani se c'era la possibilità di comprarli, cioè comprando ovviamente i cereali quando il prezzo era più basso. Ovviamente non solo le comunità urbane fanno qualcosa per cercare di mitigare l'andamento altalenante dei raccolti, ma anche le comunità rurali cercano di gestire questo andamento questo rischio possibile di raccolti scarsi, come creando dei granai pubblici come fanno le città, oppure creando una serie di, dando vita, alimentando una serie di istituzioni caritativo-assistenziali che sono destinate a far che cosa? A distribuire pane ordinariamente alla povera popolazione e a, in un qualche modo, scusate, far fronte a mitigazione, anche in questo caso, dell'andamento del prezzo o della disponibilità di cereali sui mercati rurali in casi di annate particolarmente negative. Queste istituzioni caritativo-assistenziali fanno però anche un'importante azione di microcredito in queste comunità rurali. Scusatemi se torno su una questione della quale mi sono già occupato diverso tempo fa, per la quale ho già pubblicato alcune cose, ma come ho avuto modo di analizzare per alcune comunità rurali dello Stato di Milano, tra appunto Milano e Venezia nella prima metà del Cinquecento, in questo caso la difesa, diciamo così, della ricchezza locale e quindi il limite, la limitazione dell'investimento da parte dei ricchi cittadini milanesi soprattutto in una campagna particolarmente florida, quindi ha un interesse ad investire in quella terra, quindi la proprietà locale viene difesa in che modo? Viene difesa anche grazie al fatto che queste istituzioni caritativo-assistenziali, che sono diventate molto ricche grazie ai lasciti della popolazione, riescono a destinare, a fare credito alle comunità stesse, cioè alle comunità che sono chiamate a pagare le tasse e a sostenere le truppe in questo periodo, ma anche alla popolazione locale. In particolare, con una particolare attenzione, come si vede in questi grafici, anche se adesso non ho tempo di commentarli, per i più poveri o la parte più povera di questa società, o come dire più povera, quella con meno proprietà terriere. Ecco, povero è un termine un po' complicato e che non voglio affrontare in questa sede. Come dicevo però, le istituzioni di distribuzione del rischio possono anche diventare occasione di gestione dell'ambiente e di promozione addirittura di innovazioni economiche. È il caso del mio terzo esempio, che sono i consorzi di irrigazione. I consorzi di irrigazione sono una istituzione tipica della Lombardia, in particolare perché dobbiamo tenere in considerazione che il rapporto tra umani e acqua in Lombardia è cruciale, era ed è cruciale, e cioè molta parte della bassa pianura lombarda sarebbe inospitabile dal punto di vista della colonizzazione agricola o dell'antropizzazione in senso generale, ma quantomeno della colonizzazione agricola, se non ci fosse stato prima un processo di stabilizzazione idraulica, quantomeno dalla prospettiva umana, no? Poi dalla prospettiva ambientale non è una stabilizzazione, ma questo è un altro problema. Quindi il controllo delle acque è un elemento cruciale in queste società, ovviamente permette un potere sociale ed economico non irrilevante, ma la cosa interessante è che è talmente complessa la gestione dell'acqua in un contesto di questo tipo che non solo i più ricchi vengono coinvolti nel sistema di gestione dell'acqua, ma per rendere efficiente questo sistema di gestione bisogna includere in questi sistemi di gestione anche i piccoli medi proprietari, attraverso appunto la costruzione di questi consorzi, i consorzi di utenti, cioè coloro che in qualche modo hanno un interesse all'utilizzo dell'acqua in questo territorio. Ora, per non farla troppo lunga su questo punto, credo di aver già rubato molto tempo e vorrei arrivare alla conclusione, l'aspetto importante è che questi consorzi diventano delle pratiche di cooperazione, perché ci si mette tutti insieme per gestire il territorio, diventano uno strumento di gestione del territorio e del rischio ambientale, usiamo questo termine con molte virgolette ma che può essere utile, però l'altro elemento fondamentale è che l'irrigazione e la distribuzione dell'acqua è la conditio sine qua non per lo sviluppo capitalistico dell'agricoltura lombarda, cioè se non ci fosse questa rete irrigua non ci sarebbe forse nemmeno stata quello sviluppo di agricoltura capitalistica basata su che cosa? Sull'integrazione tra agricoltura e allevamento stabile e quindi concime fondamentale per rendere i terreni grassi, perché poi alla fine la storia dell'agricoltura fino ai concimi chimici si gioca essenzialmente su questo punto fondamentale. Ultimo punto, spero di avere ancora tempo, grazie. Volevo appunto presentarvi questa pratica informale di gestione del rischio con la quale ho avuto modo di incontrarmi durante le mie ricerche, che è il sistema del famulato, così viene chiamato in Lombardia, che sostanzialmente sono i servitori rurali. Ora, questo aspetto del famulato è particolarmente interessante, non solo perché si sa poco di questo aspetto, purtroppo le fonti sono abbastanza silenti da questo punto di vista, ma perché quando poi ci si mette a fare un po' di analisi su quel poco che sappiamo rispetto ai famuli, e questo è un caso che vi mostro, si vede che c'è una sorta di stretta relazione, anzi quasi di perfetta proporzione, tra la quantità di terra che ogni famiglia colonica coltiva e la dimensione dell'aggregato domestico. Com'è possibile che le famiglie di queste, di questi coloni si muova e sia così perfettamente corrispondente alla quantità di terra che possiedono o che lavorano, no? Quando dico quantità di terra intendo sia quella che possiedono che quella che lavora. E questo si vede sia per, i braccianti, sia per i massari, che sono gli affittuari di medie estensioni, gli eredi dei mezzadri, anche se qui già sono sottoposti a contratti, come abbiamo detto, fissi, e vale anche per i fittabili, che sono quei grandi affittuari capitalisti di cui parlavo prima. La proporzione è garantita essenzialmente dalla diffusione degli servitori rurali, dei famuli, che si muovono all'interno di queste famiglie per riequilibrare il rapporto tra terre lavorate e persone che abitano una certa famiglia, un certo aggregato domestico. Chi sono questi famuli? Questi famuli sono essenzialmente giovani, maschi e femmine, che si muovono dalle famiglie idealmente, ma poi tornerò sul punto, più povere verso quelle più ricche, e che appunto svolgono la loro attività come servitori rurali in una fase giovanile della loro vita prima di costituire una propria famiglia. La cosa interessante che si vede da questi grafici è che in realtà i famuli si muovono non solo dalle famiglie bracciantili verso quelle massarili o quelle dei fittabili, cioè quelle più ricche, ma si muovono anche all'interno delle famiglie dei massari, in una sorta di circolo, cioè i massari accolgono famuli e mandano i loro figli a fare i famuli da un'altra parte. In questo modo si crea una sorta di situazione dinamica per la quale anche nelle aree meno a vocazione capitalistica, cioè in collina o in montagna, i famuli diventano l'elemento per riequilibrare il rapporto tra terra disponibile, terra lavorata e membri della famiglia. Perché? Perché mentre i figli sono membri che in un qualche modo non possono essere compressi o espansi in maniera rapida, i famuli al contrario lo possono essere in base al cambiamento delle annate agricole. Quindi è meglio mandare i propri figli giovani a fare i famuli in un'altra famiglia e prendere dei famuli in base alle necessità, piuttosto che in un qualche modo tenere i propri figli, e con il rischio che però il rapporto tra terra e membri della famiglia non sia più in equilibrio. E questa è una pratica molto diffusa nella Lombardia del Cinquecento e quindi, appunto, secondo me, può essere considerata una pratica di distribuzione del rischio agricolo molto efficace, peraltro. 'altro. Vi ringrazio.
Grazie. Grazie mille Matteo per questa bella sintesi di tutte le forme del rischio agricolo rapportata al caso specifico della Lombardia. Molto interessante quest'ultimo riferimento che facevi alla figura dei famuli, su cui magari torneremo in sede di discussione. And now the last presentation by Preston Perlus dell'Université de Grenoble-Alpes about mortmain risk management in pre-revolutionary century France. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish to profusely thank the organizers for having allowed me to come, accept my communication. Note that it's yes, I should be using the microphone or screaming, and I would prefer to use the microphone. I just would like to indicate that there was a slight error in the title that you received. It was pre-industrial France or 18th century France, and I conflated the two and achieved a title that has no meaning whatsoever. However, I have changed the title here, and so I will discuss in the order more or less that they appear in the title: mortmain, insolvency, bankruptcy, and risk management. Although I'm going to invert the subject. Let's see here. I clicked it. Is it okay? I do believe. Yes. So I'm going to invert and talk about the bankruptcy before the insolvency. But first of all, what do I mean by mortmain institutions? The mortmain institutions are corporative structures such as monasteries, schools, hospitals, guilds, whose existence was independent of the lives of its members. They enjoyed theoretical immortality. Their social existence resulted from state sanction and a prevailing legal framework. Although the legal theory and historical reality diverge. If mortmain properties were supposedly inalienable, in reality various properties were transferred to non-ecclesiastic owners, in reality. Thus, mortmain institutions function more or less as we would consider trusts or foundations function today. There are similar charities found in non-Christian societies, pious institutions, waqfs in Islamic polities. And finally, and most crucial to our reflections, mortmain institutions were not seeking profits, or were not seeking ever greater yields and ever increasing growth, which I would claim is the basis of capitalism. In principle, they were non-capitalist. And I know this claim will prove somewhat controversial, but that's very good. Let's see if I can switch. Now, there's a variety of economic specificities to mortmain institutions. Mortmain institutions managed assets from pious endowments or from other acquisitions. Hence, risk management and agency failure are possible, as well as exogenous risk, acts of God, force majeure, could befall these communities. The main advantage I would insist upon for these institutions compared to private or capitalist institutions is that they enjoy the capacity to receive pious gifts, donations and endowments, which I find difficult to conceive of the Compagnie Occidentale des Indes recevant des donations pieuses. So that's one point. There is an idea then of the economy of salvation, which enabled mortmain institutions to eke out their existence in conditions that may well have been more difficult, if not impossible, in other cases. Although again, this must be moderated. I don't want to go into great excess here on these claims, but I hope to prove some. There is also the important aspect, and particularly for the ecclesiastical institutions, of the chantries. That is to say, the chantry service masses, which form a key element in justifying the existence of many monastic communities, in that you have to have the celebration of the masses for the dead. And the integration of these communities into a much more complex recognition of ancestors and ancestor worship is quite important, and maintain these institutions over long periods of time. As you probably know, as you certainly know, because we are surrounded by them, the Dominican and Franciscan monasteries, as well as the Augustinian and the Carmelites, were places for interment, particularly of the noble classes. And then there is also a further problem. I should just add before I forget, of course, that there is the problem of the annuities that were often accorded to finance these perpetual masses. The annuities themselves lost their value in the course of time through inflation and through royal defaults. So this, of course, placed a certain burden on communities whose mass of perpetual masses, and no pun intended, increased with time, and at the same, the value of what was financing them diminished. Hence the importance of having real property underlying the guarantees of these masses. There is also a question, of course, of piety as entailing a danger of moral hazard. Pious institutions might well adopt riskier investments with the belief that pious succor would always be available, or that sovereign help would bail them out, whatever occurred. Now, first of all, I'd like to talk about some bankruptcies, since we're supposed to be talking about bankruptcies. So I went to find a few bankruptcies. Now, bankruptcy, if I construe bankruptcy simply as liabilities exceed assets plus owner's equity. And then there were a few cases of mortmain bankruptcy in 18th century France. The problem, as was said yesterday, I think Professor Rucher used the term the cessation de paiement, qui est une crise de liquidité, ça, c'était plus répandu. That was more widespread. But as far as bankruptcies per se, there are only several relatively spectacular cases. There's the spectacular example of Antoine Lavallette's international credit network, which collapsed during the 7 Years' War. It's known as the La Banqueroute de Lavalette. And the failure involved the loss of several million livres that were involved in a transatlantic system. Lavalette was a Jesuit priest, and his debts played into the Jansenists' critiques of the Jesuits and fed the growth of hostility towards the Jesuits, leading to their expulsion from France in 1762. This was a credit network that was based in Saint-Domingue. It was using a sugar system of lettres d'échange for bills of exchange for sugar. In any case, the system, which worked well, finally collapsed during the blockade, the British blockade. There is also a more interesting case. I find it at least more interesting because it resembles a little bit of Madoff's Ponzi scheme. It's the bankruptcy of the Dijon Dominican sisters in 1768. The Dominican sisters had an accumulated debt of 320,000 livres tournois. Note that a livre tournois, you can consider a salary of 400 livres tournois as a sort of standard salary, a good salary for a worker in mid-18th century France. So you have quite a bit of debt here. And during the collapse of John Law's system, or Lasse's system, if you prefer the French pronunciation, the sisters lost over 25,000 livres tournois. And to recoup their losses, the sisters speculated in urban real estate, which entailed further losses. And as of 1750, the convent's treasurer borrowed large sums from low-income urban denizens, servants, crafts workers, widows, as well as other local religious houses. Loans were not notarized. Lenders learnt that others had lent the convent money. Panic set in. Some 160 lenders clamored for their capital, so it was like a bank panic. Sisters had borrowed at illegally high rates, and the sale of the convent's assets yielded a mere 42,000 livres tournois. So the wealth of the convent was essentially in its real estate, and that became a drawn-out source of conflict. Oh, okay, I didn't know I could speak Italian. So the convent's property became a source of conflict between the crown and the municipality, and it was not yet resolved at the time of the revolution. So here, though, which I find more interesting, is that the convent drew upon its status and the lender's pious credulity. The convent's imposing presence in the heart of Dijon, the center of town, on the main square, reassured certainly lenders, as well as the fact that they were all the same, the Dominican sisters. And so you have here an example of adverse selection. Exceptionally high interest rates lured investors who then lost their shirt. And they drew upon, of course, their pious image. So any study of mortmain management strategy, insolvency and risk must differentiate between large, vastly wealthy institutions which owned extensive rural and urban assets, and smaller, usually urban institutions. And clearly, large-scale monasteries or abbeys or priories with extensive properties were not at the most at risk. But examples of bankruptcy appear even with these large institutions. And so here's another case, the case of the Pralon Abbey. It was a female Benedictine institution. Was heavily indebted in 1743 due to a vast and costly project of reconstruction undertaken between 1710 and 1729 by Charlotte de Bussy-Rabutin, the family, Madame Savigny, the abbess. She spent 152,000 livres tournois on rebuilding the church and the choir, as well as stables. And at the time, only 24 professed nuns and 5 lay sisters formed the community. So these ostentatious expenses left the abbey heavily indebted. Bussy-Rabutin died in 1739, and on June 19th, 1743, a catastrophic flood occurred after an intense rain. A raging torrent toppled the cloister's walls and swept away food stocks, fowls, 16 lambs, furniture, books, and religious ornaments. 3 women drowned. An orchard had 50 trees uprooted. The watermill was destroyed. Hence, the abbey was dissolved, liquidated thereafter, and again, no pun intended. The surviving sisters were dispatched to different convents, while the abbey's lands were transferred to the chapter of Saint-Étienne in 1756. So there's a good example of a bankruptcy. There's another factor that I wish to just briefly deal with here that weighs on these large, wealthy abbeys, that entails an element of risk, and that is the commande. Now, large monasteries, major priories and abbeys were most often endowed with extensive wealth. And the income was often divided between a commendatory abbot and the monks under a prior. It's called the mensa, are these divisions of the assets. Thus, in the case of commendatory division, the mortmain institution would seem to be quite wealthy and thus be immune to the risk of bankruptcy, too big to fail, so to speak. However, this very wealth creates inherent problems as the religious community might dwindle in size and its reserved assets, le mens conventuel, thus become the object of jealousy in its own. So there might be an attempt by the commendatory abbot to take more wealth from the remaining, the vestigial monks, or the mens conventuel. I give you an example, although this is not an example of mismanagement per se. The abbatial mensa of Saint-Germain-des-Prés was worth 347,000 livres per annum, 350,000 livres tournois. Had in 1777 been placed under direct royal management. It was la caisse des économes that was receiving the income. While the conventual mensa, which was only worth 222,000 livres tournois, quand même, c'est pas de pacotille, was attributed to the Benedictine Morris monks. And the monastery was not in danger of failure, but the royal management shows how under financial duress the king was not reluctant to directly pocket the income from part of the monastery. Now, clearly, smaller monasteries, priories, convents, and colleges were more subject to economic vagaries, and their sources of income did not comprise vast landed estates or extensive urban properties. Yet questions remain as to how well were large monasteries managed, given the royal propensity to divide monastic assets between the monastic community and a commendatory abbot, right? A practice which was authorized by the Concordat de Boulogne. I just want to mention too that no one has written any dissertation on the commande. There's no systematic study. There's a good subject for a doctoral dissertation. Excuse the text. Now, several issues and questions then. Should I, yes, I'm going to go through this here quickly. The crucial difference, I'm going to go to the underlined phrase here. The crucial difference between private enterprise and mortmain institutions lies in the practice of separating assets between several parties. It's a type of spin-off or divisional separation of assets between the religious community and the outsider prelate. That's the idea that I have developed here at the commande. So the other question, though, I'll move on to the second question about how did institutions with limited assets manage to survive, right? That's the question. If they fell into insolvency, what methods were used to redress their finances, right? This question will be dealt with in shortly. And foremost, however, is the fact that poorly endowed communities risked bankruptcy more than wealthy ones. That seems to be, a no-brainer, right? It's an obvious fact. But there's some facts, there's some other elements here that could be mentioned. Now, I'm going to show you in a second the graph of the gross income of the men's religious communities on the Paris right bank. And it provides an example of the extreme variation in relative incomes between these communities, because we have to keep in mind that you had a vast variation. And at one end, we have the wealthy prieurés, Saint-Martin-des-Champs, Saint-Louis. The incomes are divided between a commendatory abbot's mensa and the claustral mensa. While among the wealthiest communities that are not divided between a commendatory abbot and a prior are the Oratorians and les Lazaristes and the Célestins de Feuillants. So you see that the intermediate communities here, have an income between 55,000 down to 20,000. As you can see, you have a wide variation in the wealth of these communities. I used the right bank. I could give you the left bank. I just chose the right bank here, but little does it matter. It simply gives you an idea of the variation in the wealth of the communities, which I believe is a proxy for the distribution of wealth on a general scale for the monastic communities. And as you can see, there are some extremely poor communities. particularly the Capucins being among the poorest, and the Recollets, which are a Franciscan branch. But you have this distribution. And what interests me are less the extremely poor communities, although I will mention them briefly, but the intermediate communities. That is to say, the communities going from the Blanc Manteau up into the Carbiettes. So there's another background that I have to mention. In the 18th century, the French monarchy, stressed by the 7 Years' War, assigned several investigative bodies to inquire into the financial status of mortmain institutions. And in 1764, a report was submitted to the King's Council as to the situation of Paris university colleges, many of which were heavily indebted. And this inquiry occurred at a crucial junction when the Jesuits had been expelled from France. And the report made several pertinent observations concerning debt and insolvency and an overall vision of mortmain problems. And in 1766, there was what was called the Commission des Réguliers, which was tasked with what today would be termed an audit of the kingdom's main religious communities. And the Commission's inquiry ultimately led to the extinction of 11 monastic orders in France. So the monasteries suppressed were not necessarily on the verge of bankruptcy, and a variety of reasons underlay the king's decision to dissolve entire orders, largely a desire to recover underused resources. However, management issues did fret at numerous undersized communities. Many Paris university colleges, however, faced bankruptcy. And the report on the colleges outlines the main financial management challenges that smaller mortmain institutions confronted. Their insolvency, the report affirmed, resulted from the nature of their property, their management, and the difference over the course of time in the remuneration of the administrators, which seems appropriate today for some cases. So in the case of the colleges, I'm going to switch to colleges now for a second. Nearly all the colleges were endowed with buildings in Paris, as well as either royal annuities or annuities paid by individuals, les rentes particuliers. Few founders of these colleges gave the colleges land or farms outside Paris, right? These are strictly urban or predominantly urban institutions, right, that form the basis of the University of Paris, right? Les collèges, as you know, were used to house students, right? You had two types of collèges. You had the collège plein exercice, which dispensed courses, and the collège which only received scholars, that is to say students, house students. Essentially, they were dormitories with a chapel and a priest and assets that were managed to pay for the students. The founders wanted the treasurers' activities to be observed by all the administrators, even the students. Hence, the assets were concentrated around the college. However, the annuities, aside from the funds which had been irretrievably lost during the course of time by treasurers' dishonesty, negligence, or civil wars, the annuities often represented merely a tiny part of what had initially been given to the community because of inflation and systematic defaults during the course of time. So the intrinsic value had greatly changed in these annuities. So what was left with these colleges was their real estate. And for the real estate, over time, houses require repairs. And these costs required decreasing the number of scholarships in order to compensate and reinvest in the real estate. For example, the report said we could provide examples where over a decade a house that rented for 800 livres tournois ceased providing a net income to the college, which owned it, but cost more than it yielded due to maintenance costs. And a further point that's made is that it is a well-known fact that new buildings in the Quartier Latin do not yield more than 5%. The colleges which borrowed to reconstruct their properties were thus burdened with interest payments that absorbed part of the rental income and which rendered, there's an R that's misplaced there, which rendered principal payments all the more difficult. Here is the distribution of the gross income of the colleges on the left bank of Paris, to give you a further graph to show the distribution. Note that you have an enormous variation between the wealthiest institution and the poorest. And these are the small colleges. Because you have also larger colleges, such as the Collège Louis le Grand, which was the Jesuit institute, the 11 wealthy colleges, the Collège de Plein Exercice, had relatively diversified sources of income. But again, Louis le Grand was heavily invested in royal annuities, and did have, though, some rural estates. I mentioned here that it was managed by the Jesuits, who usually were good managers, notwithstanding the bankruptcy of La Valette. A further example, I cannot help but give you the extreme case. I'm going to give you the two extremes now. The wealthiest college was the college founded by Mazarin, the College of the Quatre Nations, which had enormous wealth. Almost 100,000 livres tournois of revenues that was distributed between rental dwellings around the college, because it was built on the ancient ramparts of Paris. The Philippe Auguste ramparts were demolished and the land was transferred, bought by Mazarin. And the college was built thereon. The college stays where you have the Institut de France. But the fact here is that you have a very large amount of real estate that's yielding a fair return. They had a priory outside, and they had, of course, royal annuities. The priory was in the south of France. That Mazarin was the commendatory abbot, and he left the priory to the college. He bequeathed his command. So, finance problems. In stark contrast to the Collège des Quatre Nations, consider the 26 then small colleges. Out of a total annual income of 208,000 livres tournois for the 26 colleges, they had a total outstanding debt of 700,000 livres tournois. And for the 17 colleges which concentrated the debt, their total income was merely 132,000 livres tournois per year. Thus, 18% of the accrued debt. It would take over 5 years of gross income to reimburse the entire debt. Well, you can see here you have the Collège de Bourgogne that owed 41,000, and it was paying 1,000 annual annuities. The Collège de Siège was paying 4,200 annual annuities. The Collège de Bons Enfants owed 71,000. The Collège d'Antin owed 70,000. So you have here insolvency. The most astounding situation, though, was found with the situation of the Collège de Hubert. The Collège de Hubert, known as Ave Maria, whose debt had attained the remarkable sum of 200,000 livres tournois, while the college's gross income was only 5,600 a year. C'est the Collège de Hubert, excuse me, because my eyes are not very good. Now, why? How did they get into such a hole? Well, Louis Grillet, who was the principal of the college, undertook a reconstruction of the college's buildings during the period 1731-1733. His college lacked the financial wherewithal for such a project, but he managed to get the university to guarantee the loan. And so what happened is when he couldn't pay, the creditors brought suit against Grillet, and he died in 1763. not having gone to jail, whereupon Antoine Guy Fourneau, the rector of the university, was appointed principal of the college. And despite all efforts, the scholarships were never reinitiated, and the college's buildings were finally sold after the revolution. Supposing the college reimbursed their debt at 4% over a period of 20 years, they would have had to pay 52,000 livres tournois annually. That is, 40% of the gross income of the 17 indebted colleges altogether. So it was hopeless. It was essentially in quasi-bankruptcy. Real estate investments, a priori a safer form of investment strategy, also proved costly and fraught with risk. Note then the red. Over the course of time, the college's buildings had become decrepit and have to be demolished and rebuilt. Undertaking such reconstitution, the colleges lost the income from investment needed to rebuild these buildings, and they have been unable to earn a net return from the sums invested in the property. For it is a well-known fact that new buildings in the Quartier Latin do not yield more than 5%. The colleges which borrowed to reconstruct their properties are now burdened with interest payments that absorb part of the rental income and which render principal payments all the more difficult. Those who could not borrow have to use their rental income and a share of their other revenues to pay the workers. Both types of finance leave the colleges at a loss. So the idea being here that the colleges, I'm not going to go through all this because I'm already at 31 minutes here, and I know you're beginning to get hungry, or at least. The idea being that in the neighborhood of the university, rental buildings did not have high rents sufficient to cover the costs of borrowing. There is a way to get around this, and if I have another 5 minutes here, I will try to mention it. It's at the bottom, in fact, of this text. There are ways to get around it. The Discalced Carmelites in the Faubourg Saint-Germain managed to pull it off because they built aristocratic hotels around their property. And their yield, the rental yields was higher. I'm not going to go through this all. I will spare you the details. It's simply that another example of mismanagement and insolvency is found in the Dominican College, which was one of the most ancient in Paris. Right? The Jacobin College was insolvent at the time of the revolution because the chapel had been closed by the Paris police. So they couldn't even have masses. And they had not enough money to rebuild their structures. They had spent a lot of money over the course of the centuries, but their funds were not sufficient to cover what was necessary at that time. So you have a further case of problems. I'll skip this because I think the time is going here. I wish to just talk about this final example. Yeah. What I should do, no, what I'm going to do, you'll have to read the text, but I don't mention this. Quickly, 1 minute, see if I can talk about 1 minute, the Theatine Fathers. The Theatine Fathers had also borrowed heavily. They had a major debt, almost 500,000 livres tournois, but the debt that they had was used to build sumptuous apartments around the community, and also to finance the rebuilding of a college in the town of Tulle. And so there are reasons for this indebtedness. After the expulsion of the Jesuits, the Padre Theatini had hoped to take over the teaching in a relatively prestigious institution in a relatively lesser-known place in the center of France. But I'm going to skip that and just get to the conclusion here. Note that this is the Blanc-Manteau. The income of the Blanc-Manteau is distributed relatively equally between Paris real estate and farms. with annuities being only a small part. In the case of the Sainte-Croix de la Bretonnerie, an old monastery, medieval monastery, you have the same thing. Farms, Paris rentals dominate, not annuities. Many of the colleges, many of the monasteries, the smaller communities in Paris, bought rental properties, rural farms, in the course of the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, when there was the peaks in grain prices. That is to say, there was a strategy on the part of the intermediate-sized communities to diversify their assets in the course of the 17th and 18th century. The same thing, there's another fact, if I have 2 minutes here, the humps that look like camel humps here are in fact sacristy receipts, the casuel, the sacristy, which are not usually indicated in most of the sources that we find. But you see, you have another source that these communities did not necessarily declare. That was to say, for masses paid by individuals. And it's important. These are not easy to find. But the case of the Carbiette, which is in the Marais, not far from the National Archives, does give you an example of the distribution here of income, the diversification. So to conclude, my final conclusions is that there's several strategies that we have to keep in mind. But the key idea is that you have to rebuild and convert rental property in apartment buildings with higher yields than single-family dwellings. In 1753, the procureur of the Grand Carme, Father Joseph de Laurent, drew up a detailed analysis of the monastery's finances, which I have in the text that I remitted. And this exceptional document sought to convince the chapter that undertaking a major reconstruction project of several decrepit buildings was not only possible but financially attractive. And de Laurent concluded that each year the monastery could save 11,000 livres tournois. As he wrote, each year of his administration, or each year of my administration, there were 12,340 livres tournois of savings where everything was provided for the monastery, from which it is easily demonstrated that to whoever wishes that our monastery is clearly capable of undertaking the reconstruction of the building as has been decided without borrowing nor disrupting our everyday finances. So the Grand Carme, which are located in the Quartier Latin on Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, the Grand Carme had rented 4 two-story buildings for centuries for 1,500 livres tournois. In 1757, after constructing an apartment building in place of the previous structures, they obtained 4,760 livres tournois in rent. So my inconclusive conclusions. Mortmain institutions greatly varied in wealth and income, theoretically not-for-profit persons, their strategies aimed at survival and not constant enrichment. Notwithstanding these lofty goals, rich institutions became the subject of envy, and numerous monasteries and priories were subject to commendatory abbots who did not necessarily seek to protect the institution's best interests, introducing a potential risk for long-term viability. Bankruptcies, while rare, arose from varied circumstances, often after heavy, ostentatious expenditures imperiled community finances. Insolvency was much more frequent. Financial fragility arose from reluctance to reinvest and renew depreciated assets, particularly apparent in the case of small colleges. Communities often hoped for state intervention, either the crown or other civil powers, given that these communities believed they acted for the greater good in the economy of salvation. And communities also relied on their good reputation to continue to borrow. This practice could lead to indebtedness if retrenchments and caution were not at hand. And so the final point, I just mentioned the strategy of de Laurent. I repeat what I mentioned, that some of the convents that were well managed had a surplus of revenue and they could use that intelligently to achieve a higher yield if they changed their real estate strategies. Thank you very much for putting up with me for 39 minutes.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think we have a lot of material to debate. So we have now a pause of 20 minutes. And we see here at 10 to 11 for the debate. I remember that to participate in debate, you have to fulfill the paper that are here waiting for you. Thank you very much. Well, we have a lot of questions for our debate. Probably we will remain here until tomorrow. Be prepared for this. I start with the first presentation by Lewis Wade, and I call the people to pose their question according to the order I received the reservation for it, and then we do the same for the other two speakers. Well, first, Marianne, will you come, please?
Thank you for a very interesting paper. My question is to push you a little further about the link between entrepreneurs and the public good or the common good. So, for example, there were other industries that may have deserved this government intervention, these types of privileges. So how did the government or specific officials, because I was struck in your examples how often you were mentioning very specific names. 2 or 3 people seem to be decision makers. How often were they discriminatory in deciding which industries to support amongst others that may have needed their support? Because that's going to affect, they're the ones deciding what the public good is. So if you could illuminate and explain that relationship a little bit more.
Thank you. Katia, would you please come?
So the risk and the entrepreneur. From the point of view of entrepreneur as the common good, we don't know where that was lost. How, from the point of view of the monarchy, this common good in entrepreneurship is determined. Clearly, the state sacrifices the East India Company in favor of the Landowners producers. This is not an innocent decision. I would like to know how this is actually a mechanism of political risk management rather than economic risk management. I'm wondering. Thank you.
Thank you. Joris van den Tol, please.
I really enjoyed your paper and I thought it was nice and complementary sort of as a strategy to what I discussed yesterday, that they do support demand. But I had a question specifically about the graph that you showed, increased production in the Languedoc area. I was wondering to what extent this growth also came from maybe decline in other regions. So is there internal contraction in production in towards the Languedoc area? Are they cannibalizing the production of other regions with this support? In particular, based on my Huguenot refugees that relocated to Nijmegen, which I think came from Rouen, right? Is is it the decline in Protestant production elsewhere that Languedoc is picking up?
Thank you. Juliette Françoise.
Thank you for your presentation. So I was wondering, to what extent is it a story about risk management and not rather about state attempt to coordinate like the economic policy between industrial aim in textile and long distance trade? Because that's rather the stories that you show us, especially because the state is also bailing out the French East India Company. So to what extent you really have a risk transfer, I'm not so sure. And if it's the story you want to tell, what were the perspective of the entrepreneurs? And my second point is the link between the Landowners textile and the French East Indian Company. Have you considered looking at the American markets? Because most of the London textile is sent to America to buy silver and gold, which is then re-exported to Asia, and you have people from Landowners like Castanier who are invested in this and basically financing the French East India Company silver need in Asia. So could you give us like some insight of if you have in your sources anything about the American market rather than the Mediterranean market? Thank you.
Juan Rivas.
So, first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And building on these questions, I wanted to mention, or wanted to bring something to the fore that is very important when talking about long-distance trade, but that is not really analyzed that much, which is the risk of volatility in the monetary markets, right? Of the risk of monetary exchange. And the reason why I wanted to ask this is because, as has been mentioned, specie plays a very crucial role, but 1686 in particular is a very peculiar year, and it leads to a lot of problems, not just in France, but also in England, because this is the year in which there's the big devaluation of the Castilian peso. So the American peso remains its value, but the Castilian peso is devalued by 25% and is one of these rarities in which silver actually flows from Europe to Spain, even if briefly. And I was interested in learning that they're buying the wool, the primary product, from Spain. So it is a kind of risk that is very difficult for anybody to act upon. And I just wanted to mention this more kind of a comment than anything else, because there is two markets involved, and we people that deal with trade with Asia, we're always inclined to focus on that retail market in Asia. But in your case, you have two different companies that are presenting both sides of the market, because where they're getting the primary product is important. So it is, I think that it might be an interesting question for you to look into, because it might help with the later characterization of the role that the French East India Company plays. Because there might be the question to which I have no idea, of course, you're the expert, of whether this is conjunctural, and 1686 again is very peculiar, or whether this intervention is something more structural, right? But thank you.
Thank you. Maya Zelle-Wenger, please.
Thank you very much for your paper. I want to ask you some understanding, things I didn't get in my mind, because 1683, cotton printing came from India. How is it possible that there is the reverse trade to India from printed cotton? Because all the shapes, the flowers, the colors, everything of that has been creating this kind of consumer revolution by the customers not buying linen wear anymore, but wanting to have this incredibly colorful and nice cotton, printed cotton. And this is so early that I was wondering how that was possible and how this company reacted on the multiple bans of the King of France to printing cotton. Was it exempted as it was a privileged company from these bans? These are my questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Tanya Skambrax.
Thank you very much for your paper, very interesting. I come back to the topic of common good. And as I'm very interested in the longevity of the concept of common good, I wanted to ask you a bit, it was not the same as the first question, but how is the common good being reflected actually on the one hand side, in the correspondence of these merchants, because what I know, like from the ego documents from the late medieval period, we have a lot of references to that, what is actually the right behavior a merchant should show. So the correspondences on the one hand side, and then on the like political theoretical level, the cameralistic texts of the 18th century. So I've just looked at that a bit for the German lens, and the common good remains a very forceful motive here. So I wanted to know, what about France in that age? Thanks very much.
Thank you. And I don't know if I understand well what you wrote, Thomas, that you want to have a question all there. So, please. Yeah.
My question for all of you grows out of my own dissatisfaction with my work. That is to say, when I began working on this whole question of risk or uncertainty, I kept looking for the ways in which my agents were actually managing it, as opposed to being aware of it. You know, we all know that risk isn't the variability of an outcome, it's the probability of a negative outcome. It's measurable. Obviously, my agents couldn't, because they didn't have the tools. Probability analysis doesn't exist until the 17th century. Your agents do have the tools. So the question becomes, how are they... I'm used to being able to speak without a microphone. These things are alien to me. In any event, sorry. How do they measure? Do they measure? I don't hear them measuring. And if they don't measure, then the question becomes, how, in point of fact, are they actually managing? Are they managing risk, strictly speaking? And this isn't mere pedantry, because the question, our task is not to find the present in the past, but to figure out how our agents in the past actually negotiate these things. So if they're not measuring, and if it isn't risk, you know, what is it that they're actually doing? And it seems to me, and I would very much appreciate your responses, I found all of these papers extraordinarily insightful. Is this risk management, or are they in fact engaged in resilience management? That is to say, trying simply to negotiate the changing pressures of the market over time to stay in business and to stay successful in business. And it seems to me, over a wonderfully broad range of topics, that is to say, agricultural, not only peasants, but agricultural entrepreneurs, and international trading companies, and the merchants and manufacturers who deal with them, including all the way up to the managers of more main institutions, and I'd like to be able to come back to that eventually. What is it they're actually doing? Can you find them actually engaged in assessing these uncertainties or risks or the pressures of the market? And if so, what tools are they bringing to bear in order to assure that they not only avoid failure, but actually achieve successful outcomes, which is finally the point? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I may add a final question, and I was very interested in hearing that the idea is that was the company who assumed the majority of the risk and certainty risk of the trade with India. And I was wondering if in the documentation you consulted, there is some reference to the political instability of that period, because it was very interesting for me to notice that the period you studied is that of the end of the kingdom of Aurangzeb, one of the most complicated emperor of the Mughal Empire. And not less interesting for me to observe the distinction that you introduced between the trade in the area of Surat and Bengal, both inside the Mughal Empire, while Pondicherry was outside in the area of the Dravidic kingdoms. And I wonder if this uncertainty in some way belongs exactly for this political conjuncture, the end of a kingdom and the area of the Pondicherry compared with the other two. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll try to answer all of these wonderful questions. I'm very grateful for so many questions and so much interest. So I'll try to group questions together as best I can. So I'll start off with talking about entrepreneurs and the public and all the common good. Yes, it's a very interesting point. Of course, there are a lot of industries who seek support over time for their respective industry. The industry of the Languedoc seems to receive a great deal of support in particular, I think precisely because of the fact that southern France is, as I was saying with Professor Pelouse a few minutes ago actually, there is a lot of political instability in the south. The south of France is less integrated than other parts of France into the kingdom. There's greater scope for resistance, and certainly Marseille, for example, maintains a very independent political identity up until the end of the old regime. So I think that there is a sense that it's in the interests of the crown in trying to integrate the Languedoc and Provence into the kingdom to try to offer this support to make Provence and Languedoc a sort of commercial and industrial heartland for the south of France, rooted in the Mediterranean, and making those two provinces really the heart of Mediterranean trade for France. And I think that's what carries through all of the correspondence from Seignelay, from Lagny, from the various officials involved, the various ministers over time. The ministers often aren't very consistent about their policies over time. They change their minds amongst themselves and between themselves, but the support for the Languedoc is very consistent, and that is very striking, I think. How is the common good being reflected in the correspondence of the various merchants and individuals involved? Certainly, when you look at Marseille, at the Chamber of Commerce in Marseille, they realise they're playing a game in their discussions of the common good or the public good, because they know that the French crowd has a very distinctive understanding of the public good, and so therefore all of their petitioning about various things, whether it's to do with cloth or otherwise, is very much rooted in an understanding of the public good, but it's a very self-interested understanding of the public good. They're using it to pursue their own interests, and it's something which I found very striking in going to the archives of Marseille's Chamber of Commerce last year, was that the Chamber of Commerce maintains a permanent lobbyist in Paris, and so I have all the correspondence between the lobbyist and the Chamber of Commerce, and they're very clear that any petitions which they send to their lobbyist, they expect their lobbyist to redraft it in line with the language of the court. They don't want the lobbyists to make things up or to take liberties, but they do want them to read through it and think, how can I rephrase this in a way that really suits Seignelay, Lagny, the other members involved in Versailles. And so that's something I find very interesting. And so there's a very nuanced sense that, that there is a game to be played here, and the parties involved play it very well, I think. Then to the common good and how the entrepreneur is determined, to Kathy's question. I guess I've sort of almost touched on that to a certain extent. I think that there is a very particular crown approach to the public good, and that ties into political patronage inevitably. Those who are able to lobby successfully the crown are often those with very strong ties to the Colbert clan otherwise, and so therefore the various projects which you see going on in the Languedoc and in Provence are often people who otherwise are already financiers. They're people who are involved in naval provisioning, for example. They're people who are useful to the Colberts, and so therefore they're sort of able to leverage their usefulness to successfully frame their own projects in the terms of the public good, and convince the Colberts that the public good will actually be served in all of this. You asked me how, to the extent to which this is an act of political risk management rather than economic risk management. I guess I've sort of touched on that to an extent already as well, but yes, I think there is definitely an element of this. I think that what you see here is the dynamic between the French East India Company, the CIO, and the Mediterranean Company, because the East India Company is able to be kept firmly under the thumb of the French crown because it's based in Bordeaux, various directors are based in Paris. It's very easy to harangue and harass directors, all of whom are, mostly financiers, of course, into serving the crown's objectives. There is a very strong distinction here with the Mediterranean Company, which is based in Marseille. The directors are almost all Marseillais, and they are able to pursue a very independent strategy, despite the very strong efforts of Senilet and Lagny to hold them to account. The letters patent of the Mediterranean Company were very explicit that all the paperwork from the company needed to be copied and sent to Paris for scrutiny every 2 months, I think it was. The Mediterranean Company got away for years without ever sending paperwork, despite being screamed at by Lagny about this. So I think that's where the political risk management sort of side of it comes into it, is that despite the fact that the Mediterranean Company sort of, it goes AWOL, it does its own thing, and it doesn't serve Crown's interests, it's able to get away with that because the head of the company and those around him is the major person involved in naval provisioning in Marseille. And so he's too big to fail, in effect, or too big to jail, even. He's too useful to really be held properly to account, in a way in which the dynamic is just very different for the French East India Company. So I think that's why you're sort of able to see how the French Crown is able to shift responsibility for the export of Languedocian cloth onto the French East India Company, even though this is the responsibility of the Mediterranean Company, and the Levant is a far more natural market for this cloth. It's definitely a very interesting dynamic. To Joris's question about the graph, I don't believe there's internal contraction in other regions. The main thing is that quite simply, there is a very specific way, there's a very specific style of cloth that needs to be produced for the Levantine market. It has to be produced a very specific, I'll say regulations, because regulations were being imposed for this. The nature of the dyeing, the thickness of the cloth, even the length and width of the cloth had to be produced to very specific standards. And quite simply, that was something which just did not happen in other regions. Other regions did not see maybe the need, or did not feel able to take up all of that baggage, so to speak. So the Languedoc and a few other provinces around, but mostly the Languedoc ended up with the lion's share of the production for the Levantine market. And but I think a large part of what you see is that the French do finally, at least in the Languedoc, they are finally able to create consistency in their standards and in the quality of the cloth they're producing, both in the dyeing and in the quality of the cloth itself. And that is what allows for a big break from the English and the Dutch, especially during the wars of the Spanish succession. You see that the English and the Dutch really struggle to continue maintaining the presence in the Mediterranean. The French capitalise on this and capture the market, and they maintain their stranglehold for the decades that followed. Yeah, there is an American market indeed for Languedocian cloth, and it's a very interesting one. It's something I haven't encountered. It's not something I've been able to pursue a great deal yet. I would like to, though, because this is something which you see with the Mediterranean Company. One of the privileges they're offered is that they are allowed, yes, to trade in the Levant, but they're also allowed to send their cloth to Cadiz to then put on the silver galleons to the New World. The extent to how far this is done, how much money is involved, is not especially clear to me at this stage, unfortunately. I wish I could elaborate more, but I hope to be able to do so in the future. And of course, there is the reverse trade as well of cochineal from the New World, which is very important as well. So, so there's a very clear and very strong Franco-Spanish sort of axis of exchange going on here, which is very interesting, and it makes the production of Languedocian cloth very complex, right? Because you need New World cochineal, you need very high quality merino wool from specific areas of Spain. All of this needs to tie together nicely to come to the Languedoc, hopefully at a fairly consistent price, but that's not a guarantee either. That cloth then needs to be produced and inspected to make sure that it's being produced properly, and then it needs to find its way to the Levant and be sold. There's a great deal of peril across all of these stages, and that's what I think makes this a very interesting production and trade process to consider. So is this a story of risk management, or is it a story of long-distance trade? I think it is both, and I think I've sort of touched on why it's a story of risk management, but it is certainly a story of long-distance trade as well, in the sense that it is the French crown sort of imposing an understanding of a market which they don't really understand on a company which would rather be left to its own devices, ideally, but they aren't left to their own devices, and so therefore they are exporting this cloth to India with some success. And this is something I was also discussing with Professor Pelouse earlier. It would be wrong to suggest that this was inevitably going to be unsuccessful, or that there was no demand for this cloth in India. There was some demand for this cloth, especially in Surat, but the demand was quite shallow. There was only a certain extent to which you could sell this cloth in India, and it also didn't help that this was a very politically unstable period, and I'll tie in your question to this, because, yeah, you do have the political instability with the Mughals. You also have various famines, various subsistence crises that mean that demand for cloth becomes especially shallow, and the French just weren't very receptive or very attuned to this. At least in metropolitan France, the directors or the agents in India, of course, were very keenly aware of this and were sending letters back explaining, there's no demand for this anymore, can you please just send us some silver? This is what we need right now. So you do see stronger demand in Surat and in Bengal compared to Pondicherry. As for why, I think it's an interesting question. I don't know if that is because of the political framework, or if that is simply because I think that Surat and Bengal were sort of being used as entrepot to then sort of funnel the cloth northwards to where it was colder, and also towards the court, towards the Mughal court, where there was, to a certain extent, some demand in the Mughal court for this cloth, but there is one especially amusing letter which I look forward to transcribing fully and fully using, in which the France's agent in the French East India Company's agent in Surat explains that French cloth was purchased in Surat and then sent to the Mughal court in Agra, and the agents of this Indian merchant in Agra wrote back in very specific terms, do not ever send us this cloth again. It is terrible. We will not accept it if you ever send this again. And naturally, the agent in Surat was very alarmed by this. And I think part of the problem, and this comes back to potentially the political risk management side of things, is that I think because the factories of the Languedoc realise that the French East India Company has to take their cloth, there's a sense of moral hazard in all of this, insofar as the factories and the directors think, well, we can cut corners. We just need to provide this cloth. Nobody's buying it anyway, so let's just send some lower quality cloth nobody will check, nobody will care, and they'll send it to India, and it will never find its way back to us. That did catch out the factories at one point. There was an inspection in Bordeaux where the cloth then got sent back, and the directors sort of had to walk away with their tails between their legs as a result. But you do see that then rippling through into India, this sort of issue of moral hazard, where these political processes playing out in metropolitan France ripple through into what's happening in the market in India, which I think is an interesting dynamic. The perspective of the entrepreneurs themselves, frustratingly, there isn't much material on this, and that makes me very annoyed. I would really love to be able to dive into the papers of these directors of the factories themselves. There are some papers. I still need to go and see them. They're in Montpellier mostly. I haven't had the chance to do that yet. But most of the papers, to my understanding, or at least to my knowledge, have not survived, which is very frustrating. So I can only really get a sense of what's going on with the entrepreneurs from the perspective of others, from the perspective of others writing to them or others writing about them. It's a rather indirect way of getting at what's going on with the entrepreneurs there. Then the question of how agents in all of this were actually managing risk. Yes, of course, indeed. This isn't an issue of probability, or there isn't an analysis of probability going on here. So is this actually the managing of risk, or is this the managing of resilience, or the managing of uncertainty? I would characterize it as a post facto management of, I would say, most likely uncertainty would probably be the easiest way of going about saying this. It's saying that whatever happens with the markets will come out in the wash, because the East India Company will be the ones being made to bear the costs, irrespective of what's happening with the contracts. So it doesn't really matter what's happening in the market. The factories will survive because they're not the ones ultimately bearing the burden. The CIO, the East India Company, will have to bear the brunt anyway. I hope that answers everybody's questions. I'm very grateful to you all for... to the question, sorry, yes, of monetary markets. It's a really good point, actually. Not something I've considered, actually, and so I will have to give that some thought, but I'm grateful for the point, thank you. I hope that has now covered everybody's questions, but thank you so much. This has been very useful to think with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's pass to the question to Matteo. Marianne, please. I am convinced that the point is the court. I'm sure that the European public schools.
Thank you, because it was wonderful to hear someone talk about agricultural risk. Thank you very much. So, as you know, there are many examples in agriculture of collective strategies to reduce risk. You could have talked about transhumance. You could have talked about crop rotation. You could have talked about water, not only irrigation, but water drainage and water drainage boards. All of these examples stretch back many centuries. Early Middle Ages, you already have documentary evidence about all of this. So it seems to me that the crucial question then, analytically, is to identify periods of transformation in which an agricultural society decides to adopt or to discontinue a collective strategy, because then you have an opportunity to look at which factors are really involved in these decisions about collective agriculture. So just a brief example from England to give you the kind of thing I would be looking for. Does this happen in Lombardy? And that is the example of Romney Marsh, which is a very large marsh in southeastern England, which began to be drained early Middle Ages. But in the late 12th and 13th century, we begin to have documentary evidence, both small landowners probably more involved, but also large landowners. But in the late 13th century, they become a formal collective. They promulgate laws. They claim that the laws are coming from the king, but they just slap the king's authorization on it. They really come from below. They form a jury, they have a court, they have fines, because of course in order to drain this marsh you need very diligent supervision of dikes and ditches. So it's very much a collective action that is taken. But it's very labor intensive. So the Black Death comes along, there's not enough labor to maintain this system, and so the legal system that has been built up to support the collective agricultural actions collapses because there's not enough labor to support it. As a result, the agricultural regime, arable agriculture, takes a deep dive, and you begin to see sheep husbandry. So by the 16th century, the area is simply devoted to sheep, and it is still today a period where you grow sheep. So I'm wondering, in Lombardy, do you have any of these moments of transformation that you can see this happening in order to identify the most important factors?
Thank you, Marianne. Katia?
Hi, Matteo. Sorry, you're going to be the victim of the representatives of managing risk for agricultural or rural societies, not being producers or merchants. So I apologize for that. My question has to do with capitalization and monetarization of risk in rural societies, which kind of touches a little bit on what Marianne was trying to say in a different way. So when does risk management in agricultural societies, in the case of Lombardy, moves from a more landed, social, grounded activity into full financial protection for risks? How do agricultural societies like that of Lombardy, to a certain extent, deal with rising monetarization, rising, if you want to, in financial services, and how do they take advantage of what's out there in the market to curb their own risks when that is not the core of what they do? And can they actually do it? The question is about adaptability. How informed are they? Is there really a choice to be made? Because we always depart from the principle, when you take the perspective of the industrialists or of the merchants, that there is a panoply of stuff that you can choose from. You know, the smartest will take, you know, the competitive advantage. Do rural communities have as many options, particularly in the moment in time where acceleration of financial services and financial circulation may be helpful, but perhaps they cannot reach it? So your point of view, I know it's only Lombardy, it's a specific region, but I wonder what you think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Joris?
I have 3 questions. And the first one is about, so you identified 5 types of risk. You identified climate risk, biological risks, technical risks, political risks, and market risks. And I was wondering if you reshuffle this and look at risk at something that is natural variance and something that is controlled by the individual, how would this change your perception of what is risk that you can act on and what isn't risk that you can act on? It's more of sort of like an economics of organization type question. For example, people that fly into Florence, right? They might say, oh, I was late because the plane was delayed, or I was late because I went to the airport late, and there, right? Is it a personal responsibility, or is it natural variance that sometimes planes are late and sometimes there isn't? The second is sort of, I missed in your talk the possibility of diversification of income, but this might be lost in translation. We know that you described Lombardy as the most advanced agriculture at the time, so I'm assuming that similarly, like we see in the Netherlands or like we see in England, that people that work in agriculture, they don't work in agriculture 100% of the time, and they see other opportunities like produce small items to sell on the market, or work as a servant for someone else, or do this part-time. So how does this play into your risk strategy? And the third question has to do with prices for cereals or price for wheat. Because I've always understood, or I've read that in terms of economic decline, the price for wheat goes up because people substitute luxury food with wheat, and therefore the price of wheat grows in economic decline. So is there not already an insurance in the market to protect people from risk, that if there's economic decline, the prices of their agricultural cereals goes up, so therefore they're already insured for economic changes? And similarly, when there is an economic uptick and the prices drop, there is more opportunities for diversification of their activities. So, right, there's more opportunities for them to produce other goods for the market or work in a household of somebody else, etc. So those are my 3 questions.
Thank you very much. Cédric?
Grazie. Ho trovato la sua relazione molto, molto interessante, che ha riassumato tutti i rischi possibili a livello sistematico, come si può fare per evitarli, e quindi mi chiedo, forse una domanda anche un po' periferica, come si fa per risolvere i rischi congiunturali? E quindi questa è una domanda forse un po' di medievisto, perché per esempio François Menon per la Lombardia e Thomas Labbé per la Bresse in Francia ci hanno dimostrato come le crisi dell'ambiente, le carestie, eccetera, hanno un ruolo per esempio, c'è un ruolo tra la crisi in Lombardia e l'indebitamento dei paesani e il progresso del capitale urbano. Thomas Labbé ci ha mostrato anche che se una crisi dell'ambiente, una carestia o una siccità dura più di un anno, i paesani devono vendere alla fine anche i campi, non possono più essere proprietari. Quindi volevo sapere se nel Cinquecento in Lombardia tutto quello che lei ha presentato è sufficiente per evitare questi problemi, o se troviamo anche delle tracce di perdita di proprietà, di indebitamento rurale, eccetera, eccetera. Grazie.
Tania? Tania Skamkas. Grazie.
Thank you very much for a very intriguing paper. I have 2 short points. The first one is on the water management consortia, and I wanted to know how they are created, who are the members, and how are they regulated. And I asked that question because a bit also keeping in mind the final discussion, which will take place on Thursday. Your main thesis was that risks are being tackled collectively. And I would like to know, is this collective effort visible in this, for instance, in this case of water management? My second question comes from the medieval perspective on lordship, because I find it's very interesting how you showed in your model like the triangle between the different institutions and people involved, peasants and the lords. For the early modern period, as far as I can see, and also for the late medieval period, the scientific discourse is always swinging from lordship as a way of coercion, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, of paternalistic rule, like the Pfister school. you all know probably. And so I was wondering, because you showed this example of the liberty of the family moving around, it is a very surprising finding for me. So in how far do you see, or how far would you define lordship, the role of the lords in that time? Yeah, thanks.
And the last question for Matteo, Jaco.
Miraculously, my question has not yet been asked. Thanks, Matteo. It's an enormous topic. I really enjoyed the presentation. You briefly mentioned granaries as some sort of a public solution to risk management, I suppose. My question is, what was the role of risk takers, so speculators who would privately store grain? Because in the 16th century this is a big deal. I know Philip II of Spain issued several decrees against this, and there's always a lot of fuss going on whenever prices rise. It's always, you know, these speculators who are blamed. But coming back to Tom's point about, well, what are they measuring? Can they measure? On the one hand, we have a public institution, say the Orsa Michele in Florence, and you explained a little bit as to how they try to measure. We all know that public institutions are not necessarily very good at measuring. The alternative would have been speculators, merchants. They may have been in a better position to measure. So my question is, did they play any role at all? And do you have any idea as to whether they were more efficient, better measurers, better risk takers?
Probably it's better if I try to answer in English. Sorry for my macaronic English, but anyway. I start from the first question on the possibility to measure outcome, negative outcome, how they predicted it or not. In the case of farming failure, they had a good idea on which the production move during a long time. And they know very well that each 7 to 10 years probably they encounter a crop failure. But the problem is that with the agricultural technology that they had, they couldn't do anything to overcome this problem. The only things that they could do is to build up some institution or practice to share this risk. So they knew very well that each thought year they encounter a risk. They also, in a certain sense, measure this element. For example, in the Teresienian catast in the 18th century, they consider this element to reduce the taxation in different considering the different geography of land. But anyway, it's something that they couldn't manage up until the 19th century or early 20th century. So it's something on which they have to cope with, to live with, and not something that they could manage in a certain sense. This aspect led me to the last question. Sorry, I reversed the order of the question, to Jaco's question. And the role of speculator. Yes, grain traders are important in this story. I don't speak about this particular part of the society, but grain traders are important. And during the early modern period, you can see a tension between, from one side, the grain trader that want to bring the grain on the market when the price is higher, and the other side, this institution, like the Annone or any institution to the control of the grain market in the urban community, to force the grain trader to bring to bring the grain in the city. But we have also to consider that a largest part of the grain available in the urban market came from the land owned by the inhabitants of the city, the great institution or the great noble family in the cities. So this institution and this great family have a big interest in the fact that grain bring or come to the urban market with a certain regularity, because they want first of all to maintain the social peace in the city. So it's a tension between, from one side, grain trader that want obviously to optimize their necessity, their outcome, but from the other side, this institution that tended to limit the speculation in the grain, on the grain price. Are these management resilient or not? The second part of the first question. Yes, in the long run they are resilient. As I said, okay, Lombardy became one of the first and the most important agrarian economy in Europe. There is a spread of this capitalistic agriculture. The population grew during the time. So you are in an advanced agrarian context and probably in one of the most urbanized regions in Europe in the early modern period. But yes, it depends from which perspective, because this system is resilient from a capitalistic point of view, but is not resilient from a peasant point of view. Because peasants, and now I came to the Cedric question, peasants lost their property. So yes, what you asked me about the outcome of this process is, yes, more and more during the early modern period, peasants in Lombardy lost their property, particularly in the lower part of the Po Valley, where capitalistic agriculture spread faster. Exception made from some cases. The case that I presented, or I just mentioned, on which I work on this rural community in between the state of Milan and the Republic of Venice, are a peculiar case, because these are a community in the low plain, in the irrigated low plain, so in a potentially very interesting agro-ecosystem. They already have, at the beginning of the 16th century, a very developed irrigation network, but they are able to defend the local property, not exactly rural or peasant property, local property. How they do this? Thanks to some institutions that provide credit. Credit with advantages with low rate of interest, with not push for the return of the cash. So they have this institution that intervene in this period of crisis and guaranteed the credit necessary to pay, for example, in that case, the troops or militant troops or taxes that they have to pay in order to guarantee to the wars of Italy. So The problem is that also in this case, there is a tension between, from one side, the large capital of some big cities like Milan, the elite of Milan, or the elite of Pavia, the elite of Cremona, so the elite of this big city that had accumulated a lot of money, thanks also to the trade in the late Middle Ages, that want to invest in land. And from the other side, the rural community in a broader sense, so the rural society that want to defend their property. The play is this tension. No? The crisis creates this tension, and in certain case, the largest part of the case, rural population lose their property, but in other cases, there are peculiar situations that guarantee this, the defense of this property. Marianne Kowalewski question. In which moment, which is the moment that push the transformation, that bring to the transformation? I think that in the case of Lombardy, the big point is the urban society and the population pressure. So the capital of the inhabitants of the city, particularly of Milan, that want to shift their investment from trade to land during the 16th century, because Italy, as you know very well, lost their role in trade during the late Middle Ages, early modern period. And in this moment, you see that these very big capitalists want to shift their investment from trade to land. And they want to invest in the lower part of Lombardy, where they could obtain these very important profits. So this is one of the elements that push, one of the pushing factors. And the second one is the demographic pressure. You have big cities, and not only big cities, but big cities, one close to the other. This element is important because they have to feed this population. Otherwise, as we know very well, social revolts are just after the corner. So they had to manage these elements. So I think capital of the urban dwellers, and the second aspect is the population pressure, the population dynamics. With this answer, I think that also I touch the question of Katia regarding the role of the financial service and debtability. What I don't know is how act the fittability, the large tenants, because I don't have any information about their role, how materially they play, because we don't have any archive on their farm or on their activity. We have information about land ownership, we have information about peasants throughout the rural community, but we don't know nothing about large tenants. We know their name, but we don't have their archive. So how they manage this property? We have only some information, and particularly information related to their their relationship with the landowner. So when they return land to the landowner, the so-called riconsegne, when they return the land, an engineer usually compile this riconsegne in which they find in which structure is, in which situation is, which are the situation of the land that they return. But we don't know nothing about what they exactly manage. So sorry, but I can't answer to your question. My impression is that in general terms, this financial service came only in late 18th century, but it's pure speculation. Sorry for this. Your question, 3 points. Which could they manage this risk, is your first point, if I understood correctly. How could they manage this risk? In general, I think that, as I tried to argue with my presentation, that they couldn't manage this risk as own farm. They couldn't manage this risk in an individualistic way because of what I said previously. So they knew that there are risks related to farming and that at a certain point they encounter a crop failure. But they are unable to manage this crop failure. So they could only try to manage, to distribute, to share the risk in order to limit the risk. And obviously, this is a story of power, because powerful people, so landowners and big tenants, try to transfer the risk on weak people, so rural population and peasants. But, yes? Yes.
So, if there's a crop failure, it might be... if there's a crop failure, it might be poor farming, or it might be natural, just drought, whatever, right? So, if you do this as a collective, and somebody asks, oh, please help me because my crop failed, how does everybody else know if it's natural variance that resulted crop failure, or if they are individually responsible? That's the question. Like the difference between personal responsibility and natural variance.
Okay. Oh, I think that they didn't do this distinction between the individual responsibility or natural responsibility. So in general, they know that at a certain point they encounter a crop failure. And so these institutions are institutions that are necessary to play continuously, because in this way they could limit the effect of this failure. I don't know if I answered to your question. Sorry. Second point, pluriactivity. Yes, this is an important point. Obviously, also in rural Lombardy, they are able to work also in other sector, but pluriactivity tended to be limited during this shift from common agriculture to capitalistic agriculture. So pluriactivity is obviously important in the context of hill or mountain, but less and less important in the plain, where the agricultural sector specialize in farming and crop, and the big dimension of this farm tended to limit other activities. So pluriactivity is important, but it's something that try to be less and less important in this transition from capitalistic agriculture, to capitalistic agriculture, sorry. Okay, I think that I know Tanya and the question of consortia. Consortia are institutions that were created by the people or institution involved or interested in the use of water. So when they create a canal, a big or small canal, people that use the water of this canal became part of the consortia. So obviously there are consortia in which the members are one or two, and consortia in which members are more and more. It depends on how many institutions or people had the possibility to use water. But what is important in the irrigation network in the wall, not the single canal, but the irrigation network in the wall, is that this infrastructure is so dense that it's quite impossible that only one, two, or a limited number of big institutions or family manage this irrigation network. Sorry. It's so dense that it's practically necessary that in the management of these water networks, you have to include the small like the big property. Also because irrigation network is linked also to other important function of the water. So this canal didn't only bring water for irrigation, but also water for defense, also water for moving the mills, water for sanification, water for alimentary needs. So in a certain sense, this is a network that have a collective value, in the sense that satisfy a lot of interest and a lot of interest. In this sense, the spread of this of irrigation network that is obviously important also for the development of agrarian activities, and in particular the introduction of meadows, and so the possibility of maintain on the land the cattle, and have the possibility to integrate agriculture and farming, but and these are the important aspects. But at the same time, water are a crucial element also from an ecological point of view, because if you abandon this system created by the man, this anthropogenic infrastructure, the problem is that the land and the situation return to the origin, probably on marshes or something like similar. So maintain this infrastructure is important from an economic but also from an ecological point of view. And in this sense, it's necessary the cooperation and the collaboration between big institutions, public institutions, public and private institutions, but also big and small landowners. I hope that I answered to your question. And last point related to lordship. When we speak about early modern Lombardy, we have to consider that the feudalism is something very limited, very, very limited. So the largest part of peasants are practically free peasants. And so feudal property is important, but you don't have this kind of control or element that have an impact, for example, on the mobility of peasants.
Abbiamo solo una piccola appendice. Non voleva intervenire? No? Allora questo è il momento.
No, mi scuso se intervengo all'ultimo momento e non ho anche sentito la relazione di Tullio, ma conosco i suoi lavori Tuttavia, ecco, volevo porgli il problema a lui, ma anche un po' a tutti noi, devo dire, del problema dei cicli economici. Noi siamo veramente cresciuti tutti con l'idea dei cicli Juglar, sino ai cicli Kondratiev, eccetera, eccetera. Ora, già nel XVI secolo il problema si poneva ed è stato studiato dagli storici economici, no? Ogni 3-4 anni ci poteva essere un ciclo negativo. Siamo tutti cresciuti con questa idea. Adesso noi tutti ci troviamo di fronte a delle variazioni climatiche incredibili e nulla può essere più programmato. Ecco, mi chiedo, e chiedo a Tullio, come si pone lui rispetto a questo problema teorico, questo apparato teorico con il quale noi tutti, chi fa storia economica, ha affrontato, come si pone, ecco, di fronte, ecco, a questo problema teorico, pratico e della reattività delle popolazioni agricole, come hanno reagito, se in modo istintivo, se in modo programmato. Grazie.
Sarò telegrafico. Grazie per la domanda che ovviamente richiederebbe, come dire, una risposta molto più strutturata, ma mi limiterò ad una risposta abbastanza telegrafica. Effettivamente un aspetto di cui io non ho quasi per nulla parlato, perché mi sono concentrato soprattutto sul 500, è il problema del cambiamento climatico che coinvolge la prima età moderna e quindi delle conseguenze agricole di questa piccola era glaciale, che in effetti si fa sentire anche in Lombardia, non tanto per ragioni che riguardano l'abbassamento della temperatura, che è un problema relativo, ma soprattutto per la instabilità delle precipitazioni, che soprattutto quando si concentrano nella fase primaverile sapete bene che hanno grossi problemi riguardo ai raccolti. Di fronte a queste cose, come dire, la reazione non è molto diversa da quella che vi ho raccontato, e cioè l'idea è quella di avere appunto nell'impossibilità di gestire questo tipo di cose una serie di istituzioni o pratiche che mi permettono il più possibile di mitigare il rischio nel momento in cui si manifesta. Nell'impossibilità di gestirlo cerco di mitigare o di distribuire il rischio. E quindi anche in questo senso sì, certo, gli elementi, come dire, le alterazioni prodotte, in questo caso specifico, dall'avanzare della piccola era glaciale, che si fa sentire in realtà in Lombardia soprattutto nel 600, hanno effetti su questo tipo di diciamo, in generale sul possibile fallimento dei raccolti. Però appunto la scelta più che individuale è collettiva in questo senso, cioè nel mettere insieme una serie di infrastrutture che mi permettono di distribuire il rischio nel momento in cui si verifica.
Grazie. Last but not least, let's pass to the question to the third speaker. Please, Joris.
Thank you very much for your paper. I have two questions. The first is a very small clarification question, and it concerns your first graph that you showed on the right bank. This graph, and you showed on the vertical axis, I think the total bank values, right? And on the horizontal income values, and on the horizontal value, the different colleges, different convents. So I don't really. It's a distribution of their income, but so I don't really understand. So you showed us a line graph, which suggests the relationship between one and the other. Could you elaborate on the relationship between the different convents?
I should have put the lines.
Okay, so that's okay. Well, that's already solved.
Just points, but I wanted to show the distribution. The line essentially just indicate how you have a logarithmic distribution of wealth.
Okay.
Between so, excuse me, I misled you.
Okay.
You thought there was some relationship, and there is none.
Okay. So then the second question, could you elaborate why anybody would, like the example you showed with the 200,000 livre credit, Why did they do this? Like, why would anybody offer this credit from the creditor perspective?
Moral hazard. No. Thomas, please. Moral hazard.
Let's see if I can do this without troubling the translators or the audience. That'd be an interesting change. My question regards change over time and appropriateness of terminology. I enjoyed the paper very much and I learned a great deal, but for the last decade I've been involved in a comparative financial history of hospitals across southern Germany, doing a 5-year sample from the end of the 15th century to the beginning of the 19th century. And although all of these hospitals differ to a certain extent on the basis of the political context in which they find themselves, the social context, the economic structure of the particular town or region, I can say this much about the hospitals categorically, all of them. By the 16th century, these are no longer mort main institutions by your definition. They begin that way, no question. But by the middle of the 16th century, regardless of any other variation, they are for profit, and those profits are regularly taken. They are fully engaged in the markets. They are at every level of commodity transactions, wholesale and retail, manufacturing and agricultural, basically mediating these things between town and country and all around. Labor markets, same thing, financial markets, everything from major credit transactions to very, very small scale, short-term credit transactions to individuals, to public and private entities, enterprises, and so on and so forth. And so my question, this is not France, this is not the 18th century by any matter of means, but do you see change over time in the status of the colleges and the monasteries that you're taking a look at? You mentioned hospitals as one of these kinds of institutions, but you don't have quite as much to say about them, which is fine. Change over time. And then the second one is, would you be inclined within your sample to refine the typologies any further than you already have? Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Juan?
Thank you for the presentation, and I'm glad that Professor Safley has raised this, because it's in fact I wanted to ask as well about the characterization as profit maximizers. I have to say I work, that they are not for profit. My case study is the Manila in the 18th century in the Spanish Philippines, and in here we have lay confraternities but also convents regulated under canon law that invest directly in maritime trade by originating sea loans, which is a very forbidden thing. But they managed to do this because they argue that they're receiving more endowments than they have plantations or property to invest it on. So in fact, according to canon law, it is a lesser evil to invest this money in trade than it would be to let these donations go unfulfilled, because it doesn't help with the salvation of the soul. And it goes further to, like, for example, in 1692, the Brotherhood of Mercy is thinking about lowering the premium rates on these sea loans from 50% to 40%. And they send a letter to the theologians in Manila, and the Dominican prior comes back and says, "Over my dead body." And the reason is because, he argues, this return goes then to finance charity. So let the merchants pay the premium because it's for the greater good. So this concept of epikeia, basically they're using canon law to argue that it is for the greater good that we be profit maximizing. And it was a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. But my question, or the question that I was asking myself is, where is the bishop here? Because obviously these kinds of, the argument that you pose is very convincing, is that this inflation obviously is affecting their incomes, but at the same time, the inflation should be evaluating their underlying assets, but of course they have restrictions on how they can dispose of these assets, and yet they have to incur the costs. But in the case of Manila, for example, what you see is that these religious institutions are using the canon law tribunal to argue for their economic profit, right? So I was wondering just here, shouldn't the bishop in France be advocating for them to be able to dispose of, where are these limitations coming from? What is the role here of canon law, if there is any? Or why is civil law, in fact, so much in control, right? Thanks.
Thank you. Maya, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. In 1610, in Benediction monastery, St. Gallen, there was the abbot raising a linen show in Rorschach. That's a city that belonged to him at the Lake of Constance. And he took, with this, raising this institution, actively part in the commerce of linen, and that was a great pain to the existing merchants there, because he attracted from diverse cities like Italian merchants from everywhere to come to Rorschach, like the Albertis, the Furtenbach, the Pyers, and they were all Catholics and were meant to raise the linen trade in eastern Switzerland, and that was a great pain to the already existing merchant of the Protestantic city, St. Gallen. So there was, this is, what I want to hint at, this is an example of an abbot getting really, really involved into early modern commercial linen trade. And I just wondered if this is a single example, or can we compare it maybe with Kempten, who was also a Protestantic city with a monastery in front of the city's doors. Thank you.
Thank you. Juliette?
I have two questions. The first one is your distinction between bankruptcy and insolvency. So would you say that the bankruptcy cases are related to more transaction on the financial market, which is your case for the sister in Dijon, for instance? Do you think that the difference is that you may have bankruptcy when they are starting to use their assets to have more financial operation, negotiating different financial assets? So would that be the difference in their how they deal with their assets? And my second question is regarding the Commission of 1766. You said that one of the reasons was that they were underused resources. Do you think it's related to sizing their assets? Might be a policy to find a way to finance French public debt after the 7 Years' War? Thank you.
Thank you. Antonio Iodice.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was a very interesting speech, and I have further questions that I will ask you afterwards. So for now, I will just ask the main three ones. Regarding annuities, you mentioned annuities mainly in money, from what I heard. Were there also annuities in merchandise? Because in that case, they shouldn't lose value over time, right? So is there cases like, as such, or no? And who was the commendatory abbot? I mean, was there a common sociological profile? What was the formation of the commendatory abbot? Because in my case study, I studied the commissariats of the Holy Land, which were Franciscan institutions, and you have the syndaco in charge of the accounts, and he was a layman, usually with a background as a merchant that wrote the accounts and handled the money. Could it be the commendatory abbot in such cases also paid in advance the expenses of the convent, so that he was himself a creditor of the convent in those cases that you mentioned. And finally, was there a third-party authority to oversee the accounts? So, I don't know, a regional authority or the bishop or whatever, someone to check the account and the balances of these institutions. Thank you.
Jacob.
Okay, thank you so much. I thought this was fascinating. I'm one of the very few people in the world, possibly, who is also interested in bankruptcies of monastic institutions and hospitals. And it is very difficult to find examples. So I thought that this was quite intriguing. Now, Tom already gave a pretty good summary of what we know about many of these institutions, but Tom is an early modernist. I'm also a late medievalist, so I will go back further in time a little bit. By pointing out that definitely in the medieval period, these monasteries had an ideal thing going, because they did not have to be capitalists. People would just bring all their stuff to them. I think that their main problem, if there was any problem, was managing the enormous quantities of landed property, money, etc., that was gifted to them. So they have some sort of an ideal business going on. So I guess that one of the big puzzles is why and when do they have to move from this economy of salvation to also participate in the real economy? And it's a difficult question. I think that a second point I should make is that it would be difficult, theoretically, for a monastic institution to participate in what we would call economic transactions simply because of the fundamental problem of exchange. As a medievalist, I would say, okay, who is going to file suit against the monastery and then bringing that monastery to the grounds? Because what would that mean for salvation? I'm not a religious person, but I sort of have a feeling that this is not very good for your salvation, you know? You arrive at the pearly gates, what did you do? I ruined the monastery, right? Does not really work too well. So this brings me to my questions. Do you have any idea what the religious and psychological consequence of filing suits against monasteries was? And this brings me to the second question. When did these monasteries stop being too pious to fail, or too pious to be, well, summoned before a law court?
Maybe we should go have lunch now. But, yeah, I'd like to order so I know who is, so I can address people by their names more than, so I can. But I can go back to the Joris's point, and I think I answered pretty much. Why would anyone? First of all, why would anyone want to lend to these institutions? Right? Why would anyone want to lend to one of these institutions? In other words, how could they get so deep into debt, right? It's the same as the standard question. And as I said, in the one case, the Ave Maria, the College de Ave Maria, they got into debt, but they were guaranteed by the university. So the lenders felt that it was a safe bet. If we want to talk about risk, which we can talk ourselves blue about risk, and it's all very interesting. But if you know that you have a major institution behind the the borrower, essentially was underwritten by the, or they believed, right? It was underwritten by the university. And I don't know whether they were ever reimbursed in entirety. I believe they were, because the small colleges were all reunited in a structure that was called the Prytanny. During at the end of the in the late 1760s, there was a restructuring of the universities, the assets. They were regrouped, and the number of scholarships were reduced. And then the buildings were estimated for their price. But I don't believe they were all sold at that time. They were sold later on at the end of the century. They were certainly rented out. Some buildings, some houses were sold, though, that were their property, to liquidate the debt. So it was essentially, the question here is that you have borrowers who have a status higher in the hierarchy of honors and the guarantees than private borrowers would be. Hence the chance that people were to take. I don't have cases of anyone well, I do have cases. The case of the Dominican sisters is one where people lost their shirt. And they were the small lenders, not the aristocratic, or not the bourgeoisie, who were often the subscribers of the annuities. So the idea is that these institutions, they had assets. Remember, I mentioned that, liabilities. When liabilities exceeds assets plus owner's equity, they had plenty of owner's equity. Most of them did. It's the smaller, poor institutions that only had their real estate and had no rental properties. They only had the cloister, the church. I don't know if I've sufficiently answered your question, but the idea then of moral hazard does arise. And then for Professor Safli's interesting point on hospitals, I wish I had more information on the hospitals, because it was something that was going through my mind earlier today. To assuage your doubts, I was thinking of Imbert and also Leconte Diné, who are the two writers who have done extensive writing. And Garden wrote on the finance of the Hôpital de Lyon, the Hospice de Lyon. So what comes to mind when you talk about them becoming profit-based institutions, well, it's after the reform. So you're in a post-reform situation. They're Protestant institutions now, the ones that you're referring to. No, they remained in Catholic hands. And so my question would be, who was providing the care? Were they sisters that were providing the care?
Again, a mix.
So a mixed in sense. Who else would it have been other than?
In some instances, you have tertiaries or the sisters of orders of one sort or another. In other cases, lay staff have been hired for the purpose.
And then the third point I would, again, I'm asking you the question, so I'm doing a good job. Is the question who received the net income remaining, the relicate transferred to private hands?
Again, there's no standard pattern, but the profits are taken sometimes by the city, bled off for use for other purposes, a variety of other purposes, and sometimes by individual members of what I would term, very crudely and generalizing, the political elite of a particular community.
Okay. In the case of France, I am unaware of such behavior. The hospitals were staffed by sisters. The profits, should there be profits, I would say not profits. I will not use the term profits. I will use net income that would then be used to finance improvements or to pay back debt, should there be some, or acquire land, because the L'Hôtel Dieu de Paris owned enormous amounts of property. And you have Fossieu's study of the Hôtel Dieu, right? And so he has, at the end, a great deal of real estate in their hands that probably was not simply pious dones, but acquired as well. But these institutions, the hospitals and what have you, usually operate at a loss because they're for the common good. So it seems to me that if they are making a net profit, they should be working in the United States today. Because they were doing a real good job. It's not usually the case. So that was my, and then the other question, however, I believe you asked on the change over time. And that one puts me in a corner because I'm not a medievalist. And so you have things that don't change and some things that do change. Now, what changes over time? Is it the changement in mentalité, as we say, in the belief that you no longer have to endow these institutions for the savior of your father's soul? There's clearly, I have studied the change in what we call the recette de la sacristie. There's a net drop in the recette de sacristie in the monasteries in Paris. But is there a change in the strategies of these institutions? Obviously, you started off in the medieval period, the remote Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, where the institutions were largely the dominant structure managing the agricultural system in their region. That even in Paris, Saint-Martin-des-Champs, Saint-Germain-des-Prés were foremost farming communities, first outside the walls of the city, of the initial walls of the city. And then, and this goes back to what Mathieu was, you had the importance of these domains, and then they acquired more and more domains outside of their initial endowment and became major landowners. And this is not just characteristic of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, it's also characteristic of the Célestins on the left bank that had extensive rural properties. Or le couvent de Sainte-Catherine, which was located in the Marais, which had extensive rural properties in Paris in the Middle Ages, and also owned extensive properties outside. And they acquired more properties, so they had a network, a diadem of farms that were so often, by the way, another point, just a point that I would make that comes to mind, that these farms were no longer managed by the monasteries, they were leased. Affitati, as you said the term, the leases. But we have the leases. We have all the leases. I have a list of them for Saint-Germain. So, let me move on. The case of Manila is interesting. I really would like to know more about Manila because I've been to Manila many years ago. Just point out that most of these monasteries are not under the authority of the bishop. Ils ont les exemptions. C'est l'exemption de l'ordinaire, which is probably closely to what you have in Italiano, n'est-ce pas? So they were exempt. Hence, the bishop had little to say. They were, however, audited by their orders. Les congrégations received a visit every 3 years at the end of the trienne, and they would be controlled, they would be audited. I believe, my suspicion is that in Manila, probably in the Western Hemisphere, conditions were somewhat different. And that maybe the bishop had a much greater hold over these convents than they had in the old world, where there was this power struggle. The congregations essentially were free. But the example that you give of the Brotherhood of the Mercy is a lay confraternity. So it doesn't fit into exactly the monastic case. We can't, they're a mortmain institution, but clearly there were...
It's lay institutions, but also convents and regular orders.
Well, I suspected what they needed to have for the masses, brothers from the Dominican or the Franciscan church that would come and perform the masses rather than having lay priests. That might have well been, they might have had a connection because they often had chapels in the monastic churches. So the canon law question that you raised, well, I have cases in which they sold assets. And it was the king who gave the authorization to sell the assets. For the case of St. Gallen and the linen, my question again is to you, is that was the abbot a regular abbot or was he a commendatory abbot?
He was even called Prince Abbot.
Yeah, so this is the... Was he a priest?
Yes, of course.
Well, not necessarily, because some of the commendatory abbots were not even priests.
Some of them were cooks before and raised up to Prince Abbot, chosen from this kind of monastery.
But was there a division between the abbot and the prior and the mons? Was there a division between the two assets of the community? Where the community?
That's not of my knowledge, but I don't think so. He was a really great emperor, landowner.
Yeah, I suspect if you then my question is to go take a look and see whether there was a commendatory division. Because in the case of France, most of the commendatory abbots were not interested in meddling, in entering into market relations any more than they had a mons that was essentially a rente. They were renters, right? They got their money, they wanted to extract their wealth and do other things because there were commendatory abbots that had several monasteries. You see? It was a source of money. More than a source of income. And that's the question why I leave that question in suspense, whether it was favorable or not, whether they had register, procureur, who managed well the estates or not. So, but I cannot answer any more along the linen trade. It's a very interesting question. Then, the question de banqueroute et insolvabilité. I didn't understand your question. Est-ce que vous pouvez m'expliquer en français? Comment?
Ce que vous montrez dans le cas des sœurs de Dijon, c'est que leur lien avec la banque, avec l'opération
Oui, oui.
mène en fait à la banque.
Oui.
Est-ce que vous pensez que le passage de l'insolvabilité à la banqueroute,
Oui.
c'est lié à une plus grande participation au marché financier en fait, à la spéculation et à l'échange de titres?
Forcément, yes. The question then is that, was this Dominican bankruptcy linked to a passage to a financialized embeddedness? Obviously, they were borrowing, they borrowed excessively, they entered into a Ponzi scheme where they were borrowing to cover the other loans. In other words, the sisters dug a deep hole. And it was fraudulent. There's a big folder that I have not consulted. I'm using Digne's thesis. But apparently, knowing the financial situation, they realized that they had to keep covering the loans rather than being forthright and saying, "Hey, we're going bankrupt." No. They tried to hide the situation until there was a panic, a run on the bank, and then it collapsed. And then, il y avait une question sur... c'est tout? C'était votre question? Hein? J'ai répondu ou non? Oh yeah, ça c'est une autre question, c'est qu'il y avait quand même there was congregations, il y avait des congrégations, il y avait très peu de monde. Et donc ils étaient quand même des cibles. There was congregations that were understaffed. Now, the king didn't help the situation because he froze recruitment in 1766. So there was a hypocrisy also. The question is, the king knew that there were congregations that had extensive wealth. And I think it's more, but this is, I'm going way out on a limb, it wasn't just to pocket the resources for the crown, but also to placate other interests. That is to say, the bishops. Because often it would be the bishops in the hospitals that were in theory to be given, transferred the resources. And so the king, one that you had to do is keep the bishops on your side, particularly in periods of what we call les dons gratuits. Because remember, l'Église, the French church subsidized the monarchy. It had to pay a don gratuit every 5 years. These were massive transfers. So I hope I asked everything there. Who were the commendatory abbots? They were normally nobles. Nobles, haute noblesse. Haute noblesse. You had to keep, you had a bastard of, Philippe Orleans. It wasn't Philippe Orleans, it was more, but there was one of the kings of England's bastards was given a commendatory abbot. I'll think of his name in a second. But these are people you wanted to keep happy, right? And then finally, I know everybody's getting hungry now, and I'm trying to be as fast as possible. Why and when the economy of salvation changed? Moved to a real economy. Well, I would say this idea of real economy, I'm not sure. I think that we're still in an imaginary economy today, huh? And I've studied finance for 20 years. I taught financiers for 20 years. So I'm not, we're probably in a more imaginary economy today than we were back then. Huh? But the question is, when did the financialization take over these communities? When was there a movement? Well, it's a whole question, I guess, of European financialization, really. And that you have the annuities that start in the 16th century on a large scale, right, with the Hôtel de Ville. Right, les rentes sur l'Hôtel de Ville pay off to pay off the debt, to get the ransom for François Ier, right? And the movement of the price, the great the Great Price Revolution, right? And Hamilton, the financialization. I know I'm being very old-fashioned, and at the same time probably being controversial, but I suspect that the financialization is something that goes beyond the churches. The churches are embedded in this structure. They have excess resources. They have excess capital. They have to do something with it. If you don't use your capital, if you don't give it to the king will take it from you in any case. Right? That's pretty much what we know. If you don't use it to the king's advantage, he'll take it from you. So they become more involved in these purchase of these annuities, and then get, of course, the bum end of the stick on occasion when there's defaults. Financial exchange, well, again, it's a question. I have cases of Saint-Germain-des-Prés vendent. They sell enormous seigneury, the seigneury de Montclin, to Louis XIV's physician. The Seigneur de Marechal, Gabriel Marechal, the Seigneur de Bièvre, buys a seigneury for 150,000 livres tournois in 1698, or maybe a little bit later. It's in the early 1703, and they used the money to build apartment buildings in the center of Paris, of which some still remain next to the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. So there is transfers. Sales, and then Saint-Martin-des-Champs sells the Seigneurie de Nogent. Suits against the monastery. Now, who asked me about the suit against the monastery? You asked, see, I skipped over that part. I have a suit in one of my slides. But, since people were starting to get a little bit of, nervous, and no, well, the example is very simple. It's the example of the Merceder, the Lord de Mercy, which had a monastery in, it's chef le siège, le chef d'ordre en France, parce que c'était un ordre espagnol. They were sued in front of the commercial courts of Paris in, I think it was, I have the date, 1768, I believe. I say they're 1760s, late 1760s. They were sued because they had drawn up a big tab, they had, as you say in French, an ardoise of 23,000, I think it was 23,000 livres tournois that they, on consumer credit. Right? They owed it to their suppliers, and the suppliers sued the vicar. And what's interesting is he said, oh my God, if this gets out, if people learn that I'm being sued, I won't have any more credit. And so he appealed to the king for a stay of decision by the commercial court. And he was granted a stay of 6 months to get the funds to cover the outstanding debt. And the mercy was still there in 1789, so he covered his debt. I don't have any further information on that. So they could be. And then the question, they're too big to fail. Well, that's the question, the $100 question, right? Or the $10,000 question. Were any of these, in fact, they weren't too big to fail, but some of them were really big fish to catch and, serve on the dinner table. And that's why the 11 congregations were effectively suppressed, even though some were still hanging out in their convents at the time of the Revolution. Le Merci at the un cas particulier. I would say that that's the case, is that the question of wealth and covetous, right? Jealousy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the three speakers, to the public who participated in the debate. Let we now leave the hall. We will meet here at 3 o'clock for the first part of the fourth session of the week. Thank you very much.